Senhoras e senhores, sejam todos bem-vindos. É com grande satisfação que a Universidade Federal do Paraná recebe a todos os presentes para a abertura do Seminário de Internacionalização da Pós-Graduação e da Pesquisa. Compõe a mesa diretiva desta solenidade a excelentíssima vice-reitora da Universidade Federal do Paraná, professora Graciela Inês Bolzon de Muniz. O pró-reitor de Pesquisa e Pós-Graduação da UFPR, professor Francisco de Assis Mendonça. O diretor do setor de Ciências Jurídicas da UFPR, professor Sérgio Said Stout Júnior. O diretor da agência UFPR Internacional, professor André de Macedo Duarte. Registramos e agradecemos as presenças do magnífico reitor da Universidade de Durban, na África do Sul, senhor Sui Sim. Agradecemos também a presença do pró-reitor de Graduação e Educação Profissional, professor Júlio Gomes, do superintendente de Inclusão, Políticas Afirmativas e Diversidade, professor Paulo Vinícius Batista da Silva, e do superintendente de Comunicação e Marketing da UFPR, professor Carlos Alberto Rocha. Gostaríamos de agradecer também as demais presenças dos servidores docentes, técnico-administrativos da UFPR, estudantes e convidados. Para dar início, convidamos o diretor da agência UFPR Internacional, professor André de Macedo Duarte, para fazer uso da palavra.
Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Saudar nossa vice-reitora, professora Graciela Inês Bolzon de Muniz. Saudar o professor Francisco de Assis Mendonça, pró-reitor para pesquisa e pós-graduação aqui na UFPR. Saudar, enfim, todos os nossos colegas, professores, servidores e dizer, enfim, que é um prazer estar aqui junto com vocês para esse momento que eu acho que é um momento extremamente importante, tanto de celebração daquilo que conseguimos até o momento cumprir com o nosso programa Print, quanto também de discutir as perspectivas futuras desse programa, discutir, enfim, a própria ideia de internacionalização. Não há produção do conhecimento, e isto desde a origem da universidade, não há produção do conhecimento sem interação internacional. E eu acredito que o programa CAPES Print efetivamente foi uma contribuição importantíssima para a integração institucional da pesquisa, da investigação, da internacionalização. É claro que a internacionalização e a pesquisa já existiam na nossa universidade antes do programa CAPES Print, mas este programa garantiu uma integração e uma institucionalização desses domínios de atividade que, do meu ponto de vista, imagino que também do ponto de vista da administração da universidade, certamente contribuiu para elevar a qualidade da nossa pesquisa, a institucionalização das relações internacionais. Do ponto de vista da agência internacional, o salto foi muito grande. Apenas para dar uma ideia, número apenas, quando assumi as relações internacionais aqui na UFPR, tínhamos por volta de 100, 150 acordos internacionais. Hoje esse número já mais do que dobrou, triplicou. E tudo isso tem que ver com as demandas do PRINT, visando a institucionalização das relações internacionais. Então, esse para mim é um momento interessante em que podemos discutir aquilo que fizemos até agora, podemos pensar como temos que melhorar a nossa performance, podemos então também discutir os caminhos da internacionalização e hoje teremos, enfim, especialistas mundialmente reconhecidos na temática da internacionalização do ensino superior. Então, acho que damos início ao nosso seminário com muita alegria e tenho certeza que teremos ao longo desta semana um conjunto de atividades extremamente ricas e importantes para o futuro do nosso programa CapSprint, para o futuro, enfim, da produção do conhecimento e da internacionalização na Universidade Federal do Paraná. Muito obrigado.
Convidamos agora para fazer uso da palavra o pró-reitor de pesquisa e pós-graduação da UFPR, professor Francisco de Assis Mendonça.
Obrigado, Francine. Boa tarde a todas, boa tarde a todos. Eu quero saudar, claro, o professor Ricardo Marcelo, que nos enviou um vídeo de saudação que vocês logo verão. Não posso deixar aqui de agradecer a ele e a professora Misa, a nossa vice-reitora, ambos por receber a todos os participantes, darem um apoio para a realização desse evento. Eu quero saudar também o professor André Duarte, o professor Sérgio Stout, diretor aqui da Faculdade de Direito, e o André, diretor da nossa agência de internacionalização. Quero saudar todos os participantes presentes e os participantes que estão acompanhando via YouTube, todo aí um grupo enorme de pessoas que se interessaram pelo tema, que estão nos acompanhando. Então sejam todos muito bem-vindos a esse seminário. Ele para nós é um momento de parar, pensar, refletir sobre a trajetória da internacionalização. Então sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Eu preparei aqui algo para falar para vocês, mas eu sou muito destrambelhado para ler em público, então eu vou tentar falar aquilo que aqui pensei. E vou começar pelo fim. E o fim do que preparei é dizer a vocês que esse é um evento multilingüe. Ou seja, nós priorizamos os discursos aqui em português e em inglês, mas ele está aberto também a outras línguas que, pelos seus convidados, poderão fazer uso do francês, do espanhol, como outras línguas também do diálogo aqui. Afinal, a internacionalização para nós é isso, é a possibilidade de conversar em diversas línguas, e não numa só, ainda que ela seja um facilitador. Então sejam todos muito bem-vindos. A internacionalização do conhecimento na ciência e na educação é um dos marcos do nosso tempo, irrefutável. Promovê-la da melhor maneira possível tornou-se um dos desafios, um dos principais desafios das instituições em todo o mundo. No Brasil, agora que a ciência e a educação retomam o protagonismo como partes fundamentais do desenvolvimento econômico, social e cultural do país, combatido o negacionismo e os ataques às instituições públicas do ensino superior, voltamos a nos organizar com mais segurança e confiança no presente e no futuro da ciência brasileira. É nesse contexto que o presente evento foi pensado e organizado. Na elaboração do programa PRINT, nosso PRINT aqui da UFPR, em atendimento ao edital da CAPES 2017, do qual a professora Cone aqui presente foi uma protagonista, agradeço muito a sua presença, Cone, tivemos aqui na UFPR que produzir um texto que retratasse o processo de internacionalização na UFPR. É claro que nós temos recurso à história da instituição, que mesmo sem muitos registros oficiais, ao longo dos seus 110 anos, sempre manteve uma parceria com inúmeras instituições no mundo. Em 2017 para 2018, sob demanda do PRINT, sistematizamos e aprovamos o Plano Institucional de Internacionalização, que passou a dar, a partir de então, muito maior sistemática, organicidade e registro da atividade de internacionalização dos vários cursos, programas e pesquisas na universidade. Naquela mesma época, criamos na PRPPG uma Secretaria Especial de Apoio à Internacionalização, que, junto com a Agência Internacional dirigida pelo professor André, tem nos dado suporte para conduzir de maneira segura esse processo que já provocou mudanças substanciais na universidade via PRINT. O nosso programa, o PRINT, aprovado em 2018, foi um dos maiores programas dos 36 aprovados pela CAPES. Isso nos orgulhou muito. E desde então, esse programa provocou impactos sensíveis, tanto quantitativamente quanto qualitativamente na instituição. Parte dos resultados desses 5 anos do programa CapSprint na universidade serão apresentados durante essa semana nas chamadas atividades paralelas que ocorrerão amanhã à tarde, na quarta-feira, amanhã de manhã, na quarta à tarde e na quinta-feira. Tem um rol de atividades paralelas que estão aí no programa indicadas e que os 16 grupos de pesquisa participantes do PRINT UFPR organizaram. Este seminário tem, portanto, por objetivo principal a atualização e o debate acerca do processo de internacionalização da pós-graduação e da pesquisa científica no presente momento, com vistas às tendências e perspectivas futuras. Trata-se também de uma boa oportunidade para evidenciar avanços na internacionalização da UFPR, especialmente no programa CAPES-30, mas não só nele. Além desse programa, prospectar oportunidades para novas parcerias e cooperações entre grupos de pesquisa, programas de pós-graduação, estudantes, docentes, pesquisadores, técnicos do plano internacional. As atividades desse seminário foram organizadas e se estendem por toda a semana. Nós nos reuniremos nesse auditório aqui hoje à tarde e na sexta-feira. Amanhã, quarta e quinta-feira, as reuniões dos painéis serão realizadas no auditório ou na sala de conferência do setor de sociais aplicadas, lá no Jardim Botânico. Nós tomamos essa decisão para facilitar, inclusive, a maior participação de toda a universidade nessas atividades. Essas sessões realizadas paralelamente amanhã, quarta e quinta-feira, vão ter localização em vários edifícios da universidade. Atentem-se ao programa e à indicação das salas, auditórios, para que possam se localizar bem. Eu não poderia deixar de encerrar essa fala inaugural, lá dando novamente as boas-vindas a todos, especialmente aos convidados que aceitaram fazer parte dos painéis como conferencistas, e, claro, destacar o apoio da reitoria para a realização do evento, especialmente a chefia do gabinete, a servidora Marinese Paula Tomás, que nos ajudou muito nessa organização, a agência Universidade Internacional, que topou essa parceria com a PRPG, nos deu um apoio enorme, a CAPES e a própria Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa pelo suporte financeiro, a Superintendência de Comunicação, e aqui eu vou destacar o nosso querido polaco, o professor Carlos Rocha, que trazendo a sua equipe, nos está dando o suporte da transmissão e da organização desse processo todo, ao cerimonial do gabinete da reitoria, que está aqui nos acompanhando. De maneira muito especial, agradecimento a Gabriela e a Ana Paula. A Gabriela, vocês acho que todos conhecem, é a nossa secretária executiva do Print, que se dedicou de maneira integral, desde o início da ideia desse evento, que foi aprovado pelo Comitê Gestor em outubro, e que fez um trabalho realmente admirável na organização. Parabéns, Gabriela, devo muito a você. Quero agradecer ao Comitê Gestor, que é composto por 11 colegas dessa universidade, em parceria com 5 colegas do exterior, que aprovaram a ideia desse seminário, como um momento especial de a gente refletir e olhar o futuro, apresentando e trabalhando pelas tendências presentes e futuras. Por fim, quero agradecer aos coordenadores dos programas de pós da universidade, programas de pós-graduação envolvidos, e aqueles que, interessados na internacionalização, responderam ao convite que enviamos, especialmente aos coordenadores dos 16 projetos estruturantes do Print UFPR, que também se dedicaram enormemente e organizaram as atividades paralelas, e, claro, à direção do setor de Ciências Sociais Aplicadas e aqui do setor de Ciências Jurídicas, por sediar as atividades principais do evento. Esse seminário, então, como disse a vocês, é bilíngue. Welcome to our guests. Bienvenue a todo mundo que é lá. Por fim, reitero então as boas-vindas, na certeza de um excelente evento. Façamos dele o melhor possível. Sejam bem-vindos. Obrigado.
Neste momento, gostaríamos de convidar a excelentíssima vice-reitora da Universidade Federal do Paraná, professora Graciela Inês Bozon de Muniz, para fazer o uso da palavra.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Uma grande satisfação estar aqui neste projeto de internacionalização que é da pesquisa e da pós-graduação. Queria cumprimentar muito carinhosamente aqui o nosso pró-reitor, Francisco Mendonça, também junto com você, a sua equipe, a coordenadora de pesquisa e desenvolvimento, Ana Sofia, a Gabriela e a toda a equipe que trabalhou antes do projeto e depois do projeto, a Agência Internacional, também em nome do André Duarte e a toda a sua equipe da Agência Internacional que trabalharam em conjunto as projetorias, e é verdade que foi escrito a muitas mãos, com a colaboração de todos. Queria cumprimentar o nosso anfitrião, o professor Sérgio, que sempre, eu não sei, ele disse que não quer falar, porque disse que eu reclamei que ele fala muito, então fico mudo agora. Então, é um prazer que nos recebe aqui e dou as boas-vindas também. Queria cumprimentar ao superintendente de diversidade, o superintendente aqui, o professor Paulo Vinícius. Queria cumprimentar o nosso projetor de graduação, o professor Júlio Gomes. Queria cumprimentar também a SUCOM, superintendente, a gente conhece o polaco e a toda a equipe. E ao secretariado, a todas as pessoas parte e principalmente aos coordenadores do curso de pós-graduação e aos pesquisadores. E queria, em nome da CONE, dar uma boa-vinda a todos os participantes nacionais e estrangeiros. A senhora é uma guerreira, junto com várias guerreiras que tem aqui. Também queria cumprimentar, em nome da Shirley, cumprimentar a todas as pesquisadoras, que é presidente da Associação de Química. Então, é uma honra aqui a todos os pesquisadores, essas mulheres guerreiras que tem aqui, e em nome do professor Socorro, e depois vai ficar todo mundo com ciúme, mas do professor Socorro e do professor Emanuel, eu vou mais ou menos por idade cumprimentar a todos os coordenadores e pesquisadores, que são vocês que engrandecem todos os pesquisadores que estão aqui, coordenadores, que engrandecem a nossa instituição a levar no patamar da internacionalização. Eu desejo a todos um excelente evento, que aproveitem, e com certeza este evento é fundamental para integrar cada vez mais a interrelação entre as diferentes áreas da universidade, em todas as áreas de pesquisa e pós-graduação, para que todos os cursos, o sonho de todos os cursos seja nota 6 e 7, o máximo de número 5, mas o 6 e 7, essa meta que todos nós estamos atingindo, cada vez com uma pesquisa mais interdisciplinar. Então, desejo a todos uma muita boa sorte, se aproveitem. E eu gostaria de participar como pesquisadora, mas a gente tem que organizar um evento que é o evento da Sociedade Brasileira do Progresso da Ciência, e tenho que a triste missão, a missão mais importante, que é conseguir recursos para poder realizar este evento. Então, desejo a todos um excelente evento. Parabéns a cada um e a cada uma de vocês, e se sinta todo mundo abraçado. Eu gostaria de nomear a cada um, por muitas vezes os nomes, e depois de tanto tempo, uma pandemia, vai encontrando aos poucos as pessoas, e vamos reconhecendo novamente no olhar de cada um de vocês. Então, uma boa tarde e um excelente evento.
E para encerrar a mesa de abertura, acompanharemos agora um vídeo do magnífico reitor da Universidade Federal do Paraná, professor Ricardo Marcelo Fonseca.
Quero mandar minha saudação a todos e todas, em primeiro lugar registrando o meu lamento verdadeiro de estar presente em corpo na abertura desse seminário da internacionalização e da pesquisa da UFPR. O que ocorre é que eu fui chamado para uma reunião do Conselho Superior da CAPES, na condição de presidente da equipe, que está acontecendo exatamente às 14 horas dessa segunda-feira. Mas eu quero deixar essa mensagem, em primeiro lugar, cumprimentando a nossa vice-reitora da UFPR, a professora Graciela Inês Bolzon de Muniz, nosso pró-reitor de pesquisa e pós-graduação, Francisco Mendonça, o nosso diretor das relações internacionais, o diretor da Agência Internacional da UFPR, André de Macedo Duarte, mas cumprimentar também todas as coordenações de programas de pós-graduação da nossa universidade, os professores, os pesquisadores, em particular os 16 grupos que integram o nosso PRINC UFPR, mas quero cumprimentar também todos os convidados e convidadas, sejam do MEC, sejam do Ministério da Ciência e Tecnologia, sejam diplomatas e pesquisadores em geral que nos seguem presencialmente ou pelo YouTube. Eu quero fazer esse registro da centralidade da internacionalização para a pesquisa, mas não só para a pesquisa no ambiente universitário. Se isso nós já sentíamos como muito verdadeiro antes da pandemia, agora, nesse contexto que nos impele a pensar e a incrementar as novas formas de saber e de intercâmbio, isso cresceu ainda mais. O saber é internacional, as trocas têm que ser internacionais. A nossa universidade, que incrementou muito a nossa internacionalização com o print, mas também com outras estratégias para além do print ao longo dos últimos anos, está muito sintonizada na importância, claro, tradicional sul-norte, mas também nas estratégias de internacionalização do sul com o sul, que são tão importantes, inclusive do ponto de vista geopolítico. O que eu quero é deixar essa mensagem de boas-vindas à nossa UFPR a todos e todas e, afinal, desejar um grande seminário nessa semana. Um abraço.
Senhoras e senhores, ao encerrarmos essa solenidade de abertura do Seminário de Internacionalização da Pós-Graduação e da Pesquisa, convidamos as autoridades a ocuparem seus lugares na plateia. Para a continuidade do evento, permanecemos com o diretor da agência UFPR Internacional, professor André de Macedo Duarte, que conduz os trabalhos a partir de agora. A Universidade Federal do Paraná agradece a presença de todos e de todas, deseja uma ótima tarde.
Boa tarde. Agora sim. Então, é um prazer para mim apresentar o professor Hans de Witt. Vou fazer uma brevíssima apresentação do currículo do professor Hans de Witt, que é uma das maiores autoridades em internacionalização do ensino superior no mundo. Extremamente reconhecido, enfim, uma fonte de referência não só para quem trabalha mais diretamente na internacionalização, mas para quem também faz pesquisa no campo da internacionalização. O professor Hans de Witt, ele é Distinguished Fellow do Center for International Higher Education no Boston College, Estados Unidos, e é professor emérito de Prática e Ensino Superior Internacional no Departamento de Liderança Educacional e Ensino Superior da Lynch School of Education and Human Development, em Boston College. De 2015 a 2020, o professor Hans de Witt foi diretor em tempo integral do Center for International Higher Education, do Boston College, e também diretor do programa de seu Master of Arts in International Higher Education. Ele é Senior Fellow pela International Association of Universities, bem como com sede na Unesco. Em 2022, a Bolsa Hans de Witt para pesquisadores em início de carreira no ensino superior foi estabelecida pelo CIHE com financiamento inicial do World Education Services. Ele é editor fundador do Journal of Studies in International Education, Association for Studies in International Education, SAGE Publications, e editor consultor da revista Policy Reviews in Higher Education. Ele é editor associado da International Higher Education, ele é coeditor da série de livros Global Perspectives in Higher Education e da Sage Studies in Higher Education, bem como também é membro do conselho editorial do International Journal of African Higher Education. O professor Hans de Witt é autor e coautor de dezenas de livros e artigos científicos sobre temas relacionados com a internacionalização do ensino superior. So, Professor Hans de Witt, it's a pleasure to have you here. And the floor is yours. Do you hear me well?
Yes, thank you. I hear you well, and I hope you hear me as well.
Yes.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar on the internationalization of science and postgraduate education, which I think is a very important theme. I will try to share my screen if I manage to do that. Let's see, but it doesn't look like that it's happening, because I don't. Unfortunately, it doesn't look that I managed to get my PowerPoint on the screen. So maybe if you can put on yours. In the meantime, I will start the talk, and then I will ask you to give the next slide. Sorry about that. Technology is improving very much in online higher education, but it's not always perfect. And I will hope that in the course of my presentation it will happen. I'm talking about the internationalization of higher education from a critical perspective, because internationalization of higher education is something which now is on the agenda of our universities already for over 40 years, and it has been a result of the globalization of our economies and our societies in the past century, and also because of the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of the First Cold War, because we unfortunately are entering maybe in a second one, and also in Europe in particular for the creation of the much more European programs for internationalization. So these three factors, in my view, have put the internationalization of higher education as a policy and as a strategy high on the agenda of institutions of higher education, but also of governments and of international organizations like UNESCO, the World Bank, the European Commission, the OECD, etc. So internationalization is part of the key points of the agenda of higher education institutions around the world. What will happen with that, we have to look critically. It doesn't mean that before the opening, before the 1990s, there was not already international activities in universities. Universities by nature have always been very much internationally engaged. Already in the Arab world, in Asia, and also in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period in Europe, universities were actively engaged in collaboration by exchanging scholars, exchanging students, and joint research projects. But it was very much on an ad hoc basis and in a specific context of that time. And what we have seen that even after that, there was a whole period of nationalism and looking inwards, and the international dimension were less visible. So I think my PowerPoint is now on. That's great to help me. So what is important is when we are talking about internationalization, what has happened over the past 40 years? What have been are the main trends, the rationales and drivers for internationalization of science and higher education over the past decades. And then we will address the different perceptions and meanings of internationalization in higher education, and what are the shifting paradigms that we have seen happening over the past 40 years. And at the end, I will come back to ask what might be the future directions of internationalization of higher education in response to the changing global context that we are now. That are the key questions that I want to address. Next slide, please. So, what has happened in the past 40 years is that internationalization has moved from a very marginal and ad hoc range of activities, Students going to study abroad, faculty moving to, for research or for conferences and for teaching abroad, study abroad as part of the home degree, international dimensions in the curriculum, but all very fragmented and ad hoc by initiatives by individual professors and not by a key strategy of institutions. It has become increasingly more a comprehensive and central process and policy of institutions of higher education. It has become, as I said, a key strategic agenda for universities, but also national and local governments around the globe. If you look now, more than 2/3 of universities around the world have already strategic policies on internationalization of research, internationalization of teaching, and internationalization of the service to society, which has been an enormous progress over the past decades. We also see that many governments have taken initiatives to internationalize higher education. We see that in countries like Japan, we see that in China, we see that in Russia, we see that in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and we see it also in certain parts of Latin America. For instance, the PRINT program was an example of how before the Bolsonaro government, the presidents have created a really strategic approach to internationalization of higher education in Brazil. And we see similar kind of developments in Colombia, in Argentina to a lesser extent, in Chile and in Mexico and other countries as well. So there is driving much more the agenda. And we see many different reasons why institutions and governments are doing that. We see a whole range, and I will address those organizational program strategies, and it includes the involvement of many different stakeholders, both internal, students, faculty, deans, program managers, rectors, vice rectors for international, etc., but also external to the university, like local governments, the private sector, national governments, international organizations, etc. At the same time, we see that there has resulted in many different approaches and actions with lack of a coherent strategy, and the emphasis has still been primarily on undergraduate education and not so much on postgraduate science and education. Partly because the assumption was that postgraduate science and education would be international by itself. There was no need for governments and for institutions of higher education to be involved. That was the perception of university being universal and research being universal, and so there was no need. And as I will say later, that has changed fundamentally because of the complexity of research, the need for much more funding, and also the need for much more collaboration. And for instance, the pandemic has contributed to the need for, as an example, to have collaboration. Also, climate change is doing that. Next slide, please. So if we look back over the past 50 years, mainly internationalization meant education abroad. So all forms of mobility. Mobility of students for full degrees, mobility of students for a short period, mobility of faculty for research or for teaching or for publications, mobility of programs, mobility of branch campuses. Mobility was driving the agenda predominantly, much more than the other side of internationalization, which is internationalization at home. How can we create a much more international competitive environment where competencies for all students and faculty are much more important? In that, also rankings have played an important role. Rankings have defined the way we look at internationalization in the wrong way. They defined it by quantitative indicators of the number of international students, the number of international faculty, and the number of co-publications with international authors. This gives a wrong perception of what internationalization is, because it only drives the leading of the world-class universities that already have a lot of international students and a lot of international faculty in co-publication. It also is not looking at the quality but at the quantity. And it also creates increasing inequality with those who are up in the rankings and those who are not. So rankings have a negative impact on how we look at internationalization of higher education. It has resulted by that into a divide between the global north and the global south, but also a divide between the so-called world-class universities, the Harvards, Yales, Tsinghuas, and Oxford and Cambridges of this world, in comparison to other types of universities, which are the large majority of universities in the world. We have something like 25,000 to 30,000, we don't know exactly, institutions of higher education in the world, and rankings only address something like 1,000 to 1,500 of those universities, mainly in the global north. And that has a negative impact on our perception of what internationalization is, because in that sense, the ones that are world-class and high in the rankings are much more internationalized than those who are not. It has not been driven too much by its traditional values of cooperation and exchange, cooperation and research, exchange of students, exchange of faculty, which was originally much more driving the international activities of universities. Now we compete. We compete for students, we compete for faculty, we compete for research grants, we compete for access to top publications in the world, we compete for places top in the rankings. So competition is much more driving the agenda, and in that also the development of a whole internationalization industry. For revenue sources, like is the case in the UK, Australia, and many institutions in the developed world who are looking at international students because they bring in tuition fees, they bring in local expenses, and by that they are compensating for the reduction of investments by the public states into higher education. So what we see is internationalization has increased much more inequality, has increased much more exclusiveness, and by that it has become a very internationalized approach to internationalization. It has been for a very small percentage of students, because students that are going abroad is only worldwide 1% at the maximum of the students that have the opportunity to go. So 99% of the students in the world don't have a possibility to go abroad for a full degree or part of a degree. And most of them are in the global south. Europe, for instance, is quite different. It's something like 20% because of the programs of Erasmus, but also because of the quality of education and the distances. And it is something like 9 to 10% in the United States, but mainly at the undergraduate level. And it is in the rest of the world very limited to a very small percentage. So internationalization has developed into a much more elitist, competitive environment, and recognition of changing that have created a much more holistic approach and comprehensive approach in which all students and all faculty and all departments can profit from internationalization is only happening in a very few number of institutions of higher education in the world. And although it is true that those institution examples are spread over the world and increasingly also in the global south, I mean, the fact that you have this seminar is an example that you will find it very important to create a much more internationalized science and postgraduate education, for instance. It still is very limited in its approach. Next slide, please. So, what is happening if we look to the future, and I come back to that, is that there is this increasing concern about the elitist, competitive and market-oriented approach to internationalization that still persists. Even there were people thinking that as a result of the pandemic, there would be a change. That we would learn that we have to address internationalization differently, that we have to address much more the use of technology by having collaborative online international learning, that we have to be less focused on mobility because that was bad for the climate, that was not possible during the COVID, etc. So that internationalization would become much more in a global learning and a global environment for all students and all faculty in the institution. The reality, unfortunately, is that we see already very much signs that in countries like UK, Canada, Australia, countries in Europe, the United States, that governments and institutions of higher education go back to the old elitist way of internationalization. There is a need for more attention to a qualitative and human-focused dimension of internationalization, including global learning for all, making it possible to create an employability in which students have the international intercultural competences, and that it improves the quality of research, education and service to society for all institutions of higher education. That is important for the agenda, but we are still far away from that. Next slide, please. We saw around the turn of the century already some kind of movement reacting to this whole competitive environment of internationalization focused on education abroad and mobility. We had in Europe the internationalization at home movement, which started in 1999 by saying, well, we send those students abroad, but that's only 5% at the time. Now it's more or less 20%, so they have been pretty successful. But still, it is 80% less than 100%. How do we deal with those 80% or at that time 95% of the students? So they said we have to look much more at how can we help those students to become much more international, intercultural in their outcomes. A similar movement took place in the UK and Australia. It was called internationalization of the curriculum, in which people reacting to this whole marketization of internationalization said, but what are students going to learn? What are all those international students, but also the local students going to learn? Are they going to learn something only which is Australian or British? Are they only learning from textbooks from the global north? Or are we internationalizing the curriculum in such a way that people understand what is really happening in their discipline around the globe, getting different views, different perspectives, and a much more interactive approach to teaching and learning? So that internationalization of the curriculum was a reaction to that kind of commercialization in those countries. And in the United States, you had the movement comprehensive internationalization by organizations like NAFSA and the American Council of Education, which said, well, we should not focus on a very fragmented way of internationalization, recruiting on the one hand students, send our students for a short semester abroad. We need to have a comprehensive and integral internationalization of all aspects of our institutions of higher education. That were three important movements. And what we see that those three movements got a lot of attention. But as I will say later, attention was much more words than really an action. We have seen more recently also two other movements which were important. On the one hand, what we call internationalization of research, a very important topic for this seminar, where people said, well, internationalization of research, as I mentioned before, was something perceived not necessary to have a strategy for because it went by itself. Now it's much more important. We have to internationalize research. So there's a stronger attention to also that dimension of higher education, the research factor. And the third mission of university, because we have the education mission, which already was very much focused on internationalization, the research which was emerging, but also recently there was a call for internationalization of service to society. And how can we make higher education much more at the service of the sustainable development goals of the United Nations and addressing issues that are important in the global society, health, poverty, climate, etc. So that are important reactions which have happened over the past, let's say, 25 years, but not have yet been really successful in changing the paradigm from a much more competitive to a much more cooperative environment. Next slide, please. So, if you look at internationalization, in reality, it is a very multifaceted and evolving activity. It includes many different perceptions and meanings of what internationalization is. If I ask in Brazil what internationalization is, I get a completely different answer than when I ask the same question in the United States, in the UK, Europe, or in Australia, or in Asia. Also, if I asked that question 40 years ago when I started to work on this topic, I also got completely different answers than I get now. So it is multifaceted and it is an evolving process. And the same for all the terms that we use. It is also quite different and multifaceted. Because study abroad means something completely different to people in the United States than it means in the UK. International students, we have different types of international students, but we seem to use them as one term. Internationalization at home, etc. is also there. My slides, sorry. The same with transnational, cross-border higher education. There are many different ways of looking at it. Some think it's MOOCs, other things it's online education, distance education, other things it's collaborative online international learning, others virtual exchange, etc. And the use of global citizenship is another example where people use that in a very easy but slumpy way. They don't really more than paying lip service to the term. So internationalization is not one model that fits all. Its diversity is institutional, is local, is national and regional, and has changed constantly over time to respond to changing context. And in that sense, it's also different if we talk about internationalization at the undergraduate level than if we talk about internationalization for science and for postgraduate education. Next slide, please. So, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's nice. A lot of things are happening in internationalization of higher education, so it's a very multifaceted experience, and each can use whatever they want for their own purpose. That's certainly true, and that is what is happening, but it has to be also acknowledged that by that it is a weakness, because everybody can do whatever they want without having a common vision, without having a common strategy. People talk about internationalization of higher education, which is much more the process of what is happening. But in reality, what we are talking about in action is an internationalization in higher education. Very fragmented list of activities. There are also all kinds of people who say, well, internationalization is the same as globalization, while others say, things like recruitment of students, branch campuses, etc., because we are part of the globalization process. So we are talking too much easy about it, and that ignores also the fact that internationalization of postgraduate education and research is in many contexts completely different than at the undergraduate level. Next slide, please. Internationalization, when I started to work on it, basically as a process and a strategy, was in the early 1990s completely not on the agenda. There was no research on it, there was no theoretical foundation, and I started to work with my colleague Jane Knight in the 1990s on the request of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, to develop a kind of concept of what we mean with internationalization. Still very much based on practices. So if you look at research in the 1990s, it still was very fragmented. It was case studies of institutions who had experience and they developed that. There was not so much. 10 years later, we saw there was more. I was co-founder of the Journal of Studies in International Education, and there was the first journal that really paid attention to this topic. But if you look 10 years later, and in particular if you look now, most journals of higher education and research are having topics about internationalization of higher education. There are many books published about internationalization of higher education. There are blogs, there are websites. It's a very common now phenomenon. So internationalization is now high on the agenda, but what we still lack is a really conceptual and theoretical foundation for what we mean when we talk about internationalization. And that has been one of my main agenda points to try to better understand and to critically reflect about what is internationalization of higher education. Next slide, please. So what we see is that when we talk about internationalization, we talk too much easy and using that word. We have a kind of sloppy approach of what we mean with internationalization. We are not very clear and everybody interprets it in their own way. Some have a link to the why. So why are we internationalization of higher education? Others look at what are we doing? Again, others on how are we organizing internationalization? We should look much more at the impact. What is the outcomes of internationalization? We have to look at partners, the whom, and we have to look at the context, where. Internationalization, again, is quite different in different places. So we have to be very clear if we talk about the why, the what, the how, the impact, the whom, and the where, but we seem not to do that. So that's very important to keep in mind. Be always clear about what are we talking about when we talk about this topic. Next slide, please. So the meaning of internationalization has evolved. It was very important that in 1993 and later an updated definition in 2003, my colleague Jay Knight from Canada defined internationalization as a process of integrating intercultural, international and global dimensions into the purpose and delivery of higher education institutions. That was a very important start of thinking about the meaning of internationalization. Before that, we talked not about internationalization, we talked about international education, and that was the very fragmented approach to internationalization. Still, her definition left a lot of room of what kind of meaning we gave to that process. If I would talk to my Australian colleagues, they would say internationalization is recruiting international students for revenue generation. If I talk to the European universities, they said internationalization is exchange of students by the Erasmus program. If I talk to colleagues in Brazil or in Latin America in general or in Africa, they would say internationalization is a Western paradigm dominating both research and education from a Western perspective of internationalization. So everybody has a different kind of view about what is the importance of internationalization of higher education. And as a result of that, we have seen all kinds of unintended consequences, misconceptions, and even to a certain moment that we wrote about the end of internationalization as it is, because internationalization was something completely different than what was in our view important for the future of higher education in the world. So internationalization had to change from a working title of Jay Knight as a process to a much more normative action process. Next slide, please. So in response to these challenges, in 2015, we were asked, and I was a leader of a team, by the European Parliament to think about what is the future direction of internationalization of higher education. Because the European Parliament was receiving all those kind of projects, Erasmus Plus, Horizon, etc., Erasmus Mundus, and they wanted to know how do we have to interpret what is going on. And so we did a whole exercise of comparative analysis of internationalization around the globe, and we asked all kinds of experts from all different regions, if you have to define the future direction of internationalization, how would you define then internationalization of higher education? And they said it has to be less elitist. It has to be much more inclusive. Inclusive of all students, inclusion of all faculty, inclusion of all institutions, inclusion of all countries in the world. Mobility is important, but it should not be something marginal. It should be integrated in the teaching and learning and the curriculum of higher education institutions. It should also be much more clear that internationalization is not a goal in itself, but a means to enhance the quality of research, education, and service to society. And should not focus only on economic motivations and rationales. So we came up with an updated definition of J-Knight, definition of 2003. Next slide, please. And we added some important words. We said it is a process indeed, but it has to be an intentional process. It cannot go by itself. It has to be the intention of educational leaders, of other stakeholders, of governments, to make that process really happening. And it's not something that goes for its own purpose. It has to be to enhance the quality of education, the quality of research. It has to be for all students and all administration and faculty staff, and it has to make a meaningful contribution to society. That, in our view, was the important direction that internationalization had to take. Next slide, please. It is a very normative direction. We said, well, we have to take action. We cannot just assume that the process goes by itself, and we have to make clear that it cannot be for those commercial and market and the competitive environment that was internationalization over the past decades. So it has to be normative, it has to be going elsewhere. And we've seen similar kind of labels that has addressed those issues. Comprehensive internationalization, which I mentioned already, intelligent internationalization, ethical internationalization, conscious internationalization, responsible internationalization, humanistic internationalization. They all had this kind of normative direction to be given to what internationalization is. Also, learner-centered internationalization is an example of that. More attention to refugees and migrants, enforced internationalization. Coerced internationalization in the African context was another label. And we see another term which is increasingly more popular is global engagement, which also re-emphasizes much more the cooperative and networking part of internationalization than the competitive part of internationalization. So we see in that sense a positive development of what we are talking about. Next slide, please. And so is this a really changing paradigm? On the one hand, yes, there has been this appeals for change and related calls for other aspects, like we have mentioned already, collaborative online international learning as a way of competition to the market-oriented distance education movement. But in practice, as I mentioned at the start, we see still the focus continues to be on internationalization abroad, on mobility. And because of that, Laura Rumby and I wrote already in 2017 that it seems that all this change for paradigm to a much more normative direction of internationalization for all and for service to society is still much more rhetoric than concrete action. And I struggle to move beyond good intentions and isolated examples of good practice which exist in universities. And there are several institutions also in Brazil that are doing good examples, but it is very marginal. We see a movement of new generation of scholars like the Critical Internationalization Studies Network. We see also people in internationalization of higher education addressing the climate change and how does that impact internationalization of higher education. So what my colleague and friend Elspeth Jones says, it is important that equality, diversity and inclusion, social justice, decolonization, global power relations and geopolitics, human rights and racism, gender identity and equality, ethics, multiculturalism and sustainability, have to be some of the related elements which all have to play a role when we really want to understand why it is important to have internationalization. So internationalization has not to be done in isolation. Internationalization cannot be something which is done only in the international office or by a vice rector for international affairs. Internationalization has to be high on the agenda of the institution, has to be integrated in the overall strategy, and has to be embedded in all administrative and academic units of an institution. Then it really can be a very important change agent if it is looking at much more the traditional values that were part of internationalization, like cooperation and exchange and service to society. Next slide, please. This is even more important in the current changing global landscape. It was already important before the pandemic, but the pandemic was important to learn us we have to change. But we see also geopolitical developments and tensions between China and the developed world, between Russia and the developed world as well. We see increased other geopolitical tensions in different parts of the world happening. We see an ongoing competition for global talents because of shortages of talents, in particular in the industrialized world. Health concerns, pandemic, but other health issues as well. We, of course, climate and sustainability and other SDGs. We see nationalism, we see racism, we see a lot of factors that are against the trend to be much more international. So our key questions are, how will internationalization be changed by this global landscape? How will those who are working in internationalization in universities respond to those challenges, and how we will therefore contribute to shaping a better future for ourselves? Next slide, please. And when I asked the younger generation in my field of research and internationalization of higher education, what are the key themes of the future? They identified basically 7 themes. Most of all, it has to be focused on inclusivity and equity, moving away from elitism and inequality. We have to focus much more on a decolonialized internationalization, not seeing internationalization as a Western paradigm, but based on the values and the context and the needs of the global South. We have to focus much more on internationalization for society. We have to address the issues of immigrants and migrants and for refugees. We have to still continue to focus much more on internationalization of the curriculum at home. We have to use digital internationalization in a meaningful way, or in an inclusive way, not as a market issue, but as a collaborative online international learning exercise. And it has to be affordable. It has to be affordable for all students and for all faculty and for all institutions around the world. That are key themes that we have to address. Next slide, please. And if I talk to internationalization of research, which is one of the main topic of this seminar, as I mentioned before, there was in the past not much of attention to this topic, because it was assumed by faculty, it was assumed by institutions and by international organizations that international research is by nature already international. But research becomes much more complex. There's also a much more competitive environment for getting funding, for getting access to data, for getting the top talents in postgraduate education, etc. So it is not possible to do research without having a strategy. So you need to have a clear institutional policy for internationalization of research. You have to create all kinds of related support systems and mechanisms for faculty to stimulate that. You have to create much more short-term mobility opportunities for scholars and doctoral students, both visiting faculty and for students going abroad. We have to have a much more open policy for the appointment of international scholars and doctoral students. We have to develop and support international research networks, partnerships and projects, and support the international dissemination of research. So how to make access to publications much more possible for institutions in the global South and who are not world-class, and for individual faculty. That is a very important way how we have to internationalize our research. It cannot be assumed that postgraduate education and postgraduate research is going to be international by itself. You have to have a clear strategy of the institution to make that happen. Next slide, and I'm coming close to my end. The same is with the third mission, social responsibility, which has to be closely related to research and to education. We cannot be ivory towers anymore, in which research is only done for our own interest of faculty and the ranking of the institutions and the departments and the access to publications. We have to be doing our research and our education for social responsibility. If we want to save our planet, we have to work on a much more social responsible university strategy. So internationalization of research has to include social responsibility, has to have an internationalization for society strategy, and has to be linked to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Next slide. So in summary, internationalization as a process of higher education, as well as diverse dimensions in higher education, requires, in my opinion, more clarity of what we mean, why we are doing it, and how we're doing it, and what will be the impact of what we're doing. We have to be, as leaders of institutions, as actors and stakeholders, very clear. What do we mean? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it? And what are we doing it? And what is the impact? And accepting in that sense that the context is different and that the activities might be different for postgraduate education to undergraduate education, for research to teaching and learning, that is fine. And that's even essential to understand. But we have to be clear when we talk about it, how we are going to make a better higher education for the future. And that is, in my view, very important for your policies for postgraduate education. And I think by that, the next slide is, I think, for an ending. Is there another final slide? Or? Yeah, and I think all those things ask for key questions. Who is going to do this? How can we realize an equitable and inclusive internationalization? What type of leadership do we need to make that happen? How can it be developed in a decolonialized way? How can we prepare for better graduates that are serving to the society what we're doing? How can we make systemic changes to be much more inclusive and less elitist? How can we make an effort to make a real contribution, a meaningful contribution to society? And how can we use technology in all those kind of ways to do that, to create a holistic approach to internationalization? These, in my view, are key questions. And with those questions, I end my presentation and look forward if you have questions and answers. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Hans de Wit. I'll ask people here if we have questions. Questões podem ser feitas em inglês ou em português. O professor Hans de Wit, como ele se encontra na Europa nesse momento, na Noruega, ele pediu para não ficar até o final da sessão, porque ele está com um horário já muito avançado. Então, nós vamos fazer as questões e a conversa um pouco neste momento, depois passamos à segunda apresentação. So there will be one question right now.
Okay, thank you.
Can he see me or not? Hi, Professor Hans. Thank you for your nice talk. I'm a faculty member from the chemistry department here at our university. And I have this question related to internationalization at home. Maybe I have an opinion what it is about, but I would like you to hear your opinion. And I have other question, maybe I can leave it here already. Yes, it's very nice to talk, and it's very important to talk about internationalization in higher education. But something came to my mind that here in Brazil, we are struggling to have more young people in the higher education scenario. Most of them are outside. So if we have them here, it will be nice. But how to increase the access to these young people to higher education? I don't know if you have any comment related to that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for those two questions. I think they are important. the first question, internationalization at home, what we mean by that is that we have to look at the process of all the activities that students and faculty are doing in the curriculum has to be focused on creating much more international, intercultural and global competencies and prepare the students for being part of the world. That is important because even students in your city, most of those students will not become CEOs of multinational companies. They will not be diplomats. They will not go abroad, living abroad, etc. They will work in their city, in companies and in public sector, but still increasingly will be connected with the world because they have to understand, for instance, if we talk about engineering, how engineering works in international teams, because increasingly that is complex. When they work in a bank, how to deal with products and commercial activities internationally. When they work in hospital, how to deal with diseases and with patients from around the world. So we have to prepare them to understand those diversity of context, diversity of activities in the discipline. And that's what we mean with internationalization at home, to prepare students for that. We know that we cannot send all students from Brazil abroad. Even during the programs that were there before Science Without Borders and print in Brazil, it was only a very small percentage of students that had possibilities to go abroad. So they could get good facilities, and if they are really motivated and interested, we should support them. But we know, again, that's only 1% or 2% of the student population. So how can we reach those 90–80%? Means that we have to change the curriculum, we have to change the way we are teaching and learning, we have to support possibilities for online collaborative international learning, possibilities where students can learn at distance with students from other parts of the world, etc. And we have to create an environment in the institution, also in the informal curriculum, how students can get more access to what is happening in the rest of the world. That's very important because otherwise we get a very inward-looking nationalist view. And also we have to think about the perceptions, what we call the hidden curriculum of faculty, how we can make them much more conscious that maybe their perceptions are driven by either national context or national literature or by Western literature only, and not seeing about what other perceptions, what other ways of thinking, what other development of knowledge and innovation have happening in the rest of the world. So that's what internationalization at home is doing. You have to invest in that, and the mobility is only a very marginal part of that whole process. Your second question, of course, is a very important question. What we see is that in the world, there's still an unmet demand for higher education. There's more people that need to go to higher education than there's offer for higher education. We have come to a kind of what we call universal higher education in most of Europe and in North America, Australia, Japan, Korea, where more than 50%, even to 70 or 80% of the students of the age group of 18 to 25 are in higher education. But in Latin America, it's still in most countries under the 50%, and even in some countries even far less. In Asia, the same. Even in China, it's only close to 50% now. And in India, it's around 30%. In Africa, it's less than 15%. So there is still a lot of people who have not access to higher education. We don't need 100% because the labor market needs also students, people who are not educated, but 70% is perceived as being the approach that you have to aspire to reach out. We see a growth, we see enormous growth, and what is happening is that in most countries, that growth is not anymore covered by the public sector. It's covered mostly by the private sector. Brazil is a very clear example. There are much more students and institutions of higher education in the private sector than in the public sector. And we see another movement is that students go abroad to study abroad. Something like now 6 million students are studying in other country than their home country, which is the double than 10 years ago. And we expect that it will be growing to 10 million. So we need to ask governments to have more possibilities for access to public higher education, because the private sector, with exceptions like Catholic universities, which are good quality, in general is at the lower end of quality of higher education. So we have to improve the public sector and to make access to the public sector better. But at the same time, we have to do it with enough funding. Take your fellow country, neighbor country, Argentina, where they have a high public sector with free access to higher education, not limited by entrance exams like is the case in Brazil, but then they don't fund the public sector. So you have a lot of students that go there, but they don't get quality education. So the retention is very low and the dropout rate is enormous. Sector. And if you invest in the private sector, you have to increase much more the access to good quality private higher education and not leave it to the lower end. It's not an easy issue, but the government has to really work hard to make that possible. And you can use all kinds of mechanisms to make it more easier. I've seen examples even in Campinas in Brazil, where during the pandemic, they gave laptops to students that are in the local communities to give them still access to higher education in Campinas. And there are other examples that you can use to make it much more easier, but you have to have, again, an intention to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Temos mais alguma questão, por favor? So, I profit from the occasion just to ask what your opinion is, Professor Hans. Here in Brazil, one of the key issues when you think in terms of internationalization problems is linguistic problem, because we are a continental country and we speak Portuguese, and Portuguese is not a very well-known language for internationalization relations. So then we come to the question of linguistic policies. Here in our university, we've been doing that in terms of multilingualism. It's not only English, but then the big issue is that we have not only to know how to teach the students to get in touch and learn English, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because the students, they are used to internet and they connect with people all around the world, but then the teachers, researchers, many times they're not used to teaching in English. And especially here in Brazil, when we're a huge country, everyone's speaking Portuguese, then it might sound a little awkward to deliver a class, be it in graduate or undergraduate, in English. So what is your opinion on linguistic policies, and how do you think we could improve it? So, because this is a basic tool for us to connect internationally. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. It's a question that always comes up, and it's an important question and not easy to answer. I mean, I think the positive side already is that you have a multilinguistic policy and not a policy to be teaching in English only, or to demand that all students know perfectly English and faculty know perfectly English, but that you have a multicultural option. That I think is already a very good start, because otherwise we increase the dominance of English as the lingua franca in higher education and research, which I think is a fact, but we're trying not to strengthen it even more, but we have to create a much more diversity. We also will see in the future, by the way, that technology will make it much easier to have a multilinguistical policy than it currently has, because all the tools that are translation tools are improving rapidly, and that will help enormously to decrease the dependency on English. The big problem is that universities cannot solve the lack of language skills of their students and not of their faculty. You have to start to do that in primary education. And the second point is that you have to practice a language if you learn it. If you don't have the opportunity to practice it, it will not develop. I mean, I'm here now with my my children and grandchildren in Norway, but they are French from origin and they moved to Norway because my wife is French, and they try to that the children, the grandchildren, learn also French. But then, how do you do that when they never can practice because nobody else in the school speaks French? So all their children speak Norwegian. So that's a very good challenge. So the families have to do that, and the teachers have to do that. So, but you have to start in primary school. You have to create all kind of opportunities to practice the languages, and then you come to the university with either an interest in one language, German or Spanish or Chinese or French or English, and then you can use that in your teaching and learning, and you can also do it in your research. So, but the big problem is, especially in Latin America, is that you try to solve that problem at the university, which costs you an enormous amount of time in a curriculum which is already completely full. It is an effort which is not easy because, as you say, the faculty that teaches is not always that good. So it doesn't help. And at the same time, it's not always needed when you are learning English, for instance. Not all students who are graduating from a university need English. They might, in many cases, they much better learn French or Spanish or in the future Mandarin or something like that, some language like that. So try to be also clear about why are you doing this and what do you want to reach out with it? What will be the impact of what you are doing? I give you one example from an experience which I have had in Colombia. I was in El Paso at the frontier between Colombia and Ecuador in a university in really an indigenous community. And there was the dean of a nursing school, and he said, well, the government now has forced us over the past decades that students need to reach in our nursing school B2 level of English, which is already a low level, but it's still that you can communicate. And he said, I never succeed really my students to get to that level, and it costs me an enormous amount of part of the curriculum which I need for really learning them nursing. And I said, that's exactly a wrong approach to language. Most 99%, if not more, of all your graduates are going to work in the local indigenous communities around you. They need to understand local indigenous languages, or they need to understand local indigenous culture and the way of how they deal with health and patients, etc. So it's a waste of time then you focus on English as a language. So again, the question why you have to do it was not well perceived by the government and had a very negative impact on higher education in those kind of communities. So always think about it. Why are we doing it? And what will be the impact of what we learn? And I think starting with the multilingual approach is good, but also starting to force your government to learn languages much more at an earlier level is also important. And then the faculty, they have to use the technologies. I mean, we even now in Boston are starting to use Google Translate to make it possible that students have much more access to other sources of publications than only the English dominant journals. And it's has so much improved. So let the faculty also use those kind of means to get access to other sources in other languages than their own.
Thank you so much. Teríamos mais alguma questão? So, Professor Hans, thank you so much for your time, for your presentation. It was really helpful and thoughtful in many ways. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, and I wish you all a very good follow in the next presentations and during the next coming days of your seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye. Então, quero apresentar nosso segundo convidado dessa tarde, professor Dr. Adel El-Zain. Professor Adel El-Zain, ele é vice-reitor de pesquisa, criação, parceria e internacionalização da Université du Québec em Ottawa, no Canadá. Ele supervisiona a estratégia de pesquisa universitária e grandes projetos, bem como os compromissos de parceria e internacionalização da sua universidade no Quebec e com instituições internacionais. A EQO é membro da rede da Université du Québec e está localizada em Gatineau, no Quebec. Os principais interesses do professor Adel abrangem as questões estratégicas da internacionalização do ensino superior, desenvolvimento e implementação de estratégias nacionais e institucionais de internacionalização, avaliação da internacionalização e o contributo da internacionalização para diferentes dimensões do ensino superior. Dr. El-Zain trabalhou em várias instituições e organizações de pesquisa e ensino superior, tais como, recentemente, University of Ottawa, onde atuou por 3 anos como vice-presidente internacional associado, Universidade de British Columbia, UBC, onde ele ocupou o cargo de diretor executivo internacional. Também foi diretor-geral de internacionalização da Université de Sherbrooke, no Quebec, e especialista sênior do Programa Tecnologias de Informação e Comunicação para o Desenvolvimento, junto ao Centro de Pesquisa e Desenvolvimento Internacional do Canadá, Escritório Regional do Oriente Médio, Norte da África, também com sede no Cairo, Egito. Dr. El-Zain, ele é ex-presidente imediato da Associação de Administradores de Educação Internacional, AIEA, com sede nos Estados Unidos, e ele presidiu a Conferência Internacional Anual do AIEA de 2022 em Louisiana. So thank you so much, Professor Adel, for being here with us. It's a pleasure having you here, and floor is yours. Okay.
I hope I will be good enough to use the microphone, my 2 hands for the computer, because I need to switch from this presentation. Can you display my presentation, please? To another system. But first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to this seminar. And I want also to congratulate the university for what you are doing in terms of internationalization. We know your university very well in Canada, in Quebec. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. We will see. So also, I am really honored to be on this panel, to share this panel with Hans David, and with Professor Connie McManus. So it's a pleasure for me. After Hans, actually, let me try something. Yeah, this is the PowerPoint. This one? No, the PDF. We have 3 solutions, actually, because we tested just before. So we tested the PowerPoint, the PDF, and another software I am using. It's called FreeMind for the mind mapping. So we tested the 3 of them, and I told Andre, we have no guarantee. We will see after. So actually, I was asked to talk about internationalization of science and postgraduate studies. And I tried to focus my work on science because I want really to benefit from this opportunity here and to apply something I have been developing for a few years now, what I called the systemic internationalization or the systemic approach to internationalization. So internationalization of science is very easy to say, but actually it's very, very difficult, very challenging topic, oftentimes because we assume that science is international. I'm sure you heard a lot of time people saying mathematics are universal. You don't need to have Brazilian mathematics or Canadian mathematics. And after time we say, this is true because it's science. Okay, so it must apply everywhere. Is it true? Is science really universal or international? I think this is the question we need to ask ourselves. And also, we need to really ask ourselves if we have a place, if we leave some room for different sciences, for sciences specific to a country or to culture. This is one of the questions we must ask ourselves. And I'm not sure we can display, but in case. So, I developed for the presentation, no. Do you mind if I leave it like this? It's okay, huh? Okay. So I will have this very short introduction, some discussion about the science, if it's universal, the University of Science, and how we can have, if we can have international sciences. I will go to the imperative, what I call the imperative of internationalization, internationalizing science. In my opinion, we have no choice. We need to internationalize science. I will tell you why. But I will tell you also how we will internationalize, or we can internationalize science. And I will discuss some benefits and impacts. So, universality of science is very old discussion. It's really not new. Philosophers, people who work on the history of science, on the epistemology, they have been discussing this issue for not years, centuries, right? And oftentimes we have a debate, we have a dilemma, because we have also the science of the strong, of the triumphant civilization. For example, the Greek civilization, and after that, you know, the Arab civilization, then the European civilization, and for years now, or maybe about 50 years, we have the North American, you know, power. And we don't want the Chinese to become the next, you know, I mean, they don't want the Chinese to become the new strong science, or to participate into this science. But also, the question could be also asked about not only the results of science, but also about the method we use, the way we develop science, the way we develop research. Can we imagine, for example, the same project, but with two different approaches? If you are, for example, African or Latin American, can we imagine we can reach the same results with different approaches? For example, let me share something with you. As André said, a few years ago, I worked in North Africa, and I remember the French Library of Alexandria. They imported a scientific encyclopedia from France. So they translated the encyclopedia, the scientific encyclopedia, into Arabic for children, for elementary schools. And they realized that some of the scientific experience in the encyclopedia used wine, the white wine. So the question said, or in the test, the experience, they said, ask your mother to bring a cup of white wine. How you do this experience in Muslim society where you are not supposed to have wine at home? So they did some research, and they replaced the wine with vinegar. And it looks like it worked. So it was very good experience here, and very good example for me. I like to share about how science can be localized or internationalized in this situation. I think I would like to quote this citation here about science is universal in at least two fundamental ways. First, with regard to the applicability of and validity of methods, the generality of the physical law, and the effect of scientific knowledge on human functions. There is a caveat here. oftentimes when we talk about science, we are talking about mathematics, physics, not social science or humanities. But for me, all sciences are sciences, even language teaching. Okay, it's not only mathematics or physics. Second, with regard to the participation of humankind in it. So in sciences growth, rooted in the discoveries of all nations and the knowledge it provides, or it can provide, universally shared, etc. I think this is very good citation, very good position, but it allows us also to recognize the diversity of point of view, okay? Because when we say rooted in the discovery of all nations, it means we can have different discoveries. So if we are talking about internationalization of science, which science then in this case, if we say it's rooted in discoveries of all nations? I think for us now, it's very important to talk very seriously about internationalization of science and to take actions to internationalize science. Why? Because it's not enough to say science is international because my faculty members, they studied in France, in the United States, and they are doing research with groups from around the world. So it's not enough to say we are already international, we are already internationalized as faculty members, so then the science we produce is international. I remember in, I think it was in Sherbrooke or at UBC, one of my previous former employers, we were asked to work on internationalizing research. And the first answer I get from the vice president at that time, he said, we are already international. We publish in international journals. We publish in English. So are we really international if we publish in international scientific journal? Also, sometimes because we have collaborations, we have partners around the world, we think it's enough. Hans David, he just said the internationalization process needs to be intentional. And by intentional, we mean it has to be really a decision, not just because you studied in France, so then you are internationalized and you are connected to France, so then your faculty or your program is international. It's not enough. So it has to be intentional, which means we have to make a decision about internationalizing science or research in this case. On the other hand, as we said, oftentimes we internationalize by connecting with Europe, with Canada, with UK, etc. If I partner with a university in Tanzania, for example, am I internationalizing my research? Or am I internationalizing the university in Tanzania? Oftentimes I will repeat, we are all international vis-a-vis each other. You are international for me, and I am international for you. My wife, she is Canadian. And my wife is very international for my mother. Okay? She see her as, she love her, first of all, but she told me, she is foreigner. She is international, you know? So we are all international. So what do we mean by internationalizing in this case, and what is the bias for English language? You talked about English language, it was a very interesting question. And when we teach science, especially if we teach it in a second language, are we teaching the Western concepts of science? Are we teaching the Western methodology? And is there a place or room for other approaches? I think it's not important here. I think we need, as I said, we need to internationalize science, and the why we want to internationalize science is here a very important point. Scientists are more than ever asked to work on the international scene, to work collaboratively, to work in international teams, in international networks. All of you, I'm sure you have networks, and you are asked to connect with Europe or other country. So they have this imperative of working internationally. But also the humanity is facing very serious global challenges. The pandemic started in China, yes, but actually it becomes a pandemic. So all of us, we were affected by the pandemic. All of us now, we face the climate change problems, the climate change issues. All of us, we are affected by any international conflicts, okay? You have a war now in Europe. I'm sure we have consequences here in Brazil. We have very serious consequences in Canada of the war in Ukraine. And you know, sometimes even the relation is in the other direction. Let me give you an example. You know, I live in Canada, not in Montreal, in Gatineau, but Montreal is not very far. In my family in Lebanon, I'm from Lebanon originally, when they think about Canada, they think Montreal. They don't know other cities. So a few months ago, we witnessed some demonstrations in Montreal. So my mother was very worrying about us. So she's in Lebanon. She don't speak French, she don't speak English, she speaks only Arabic. She called me and she said, we hope you are safe. There is some demonstration, we heard about demonstration in Montreal. So you see how the world is connected now and we are interconnected. This is, you know, I'm very old now. Imagine the young people, how they face this. You succeeded. Cool. Is this the right one? Are you using the PDF? Okay, good. No problem, no problem. It's okay. So humanity faces global challenges. We share these global challenges. We need to find solutions, but also global solutions need to be localized, need to be adapted to local culture, local circumstances, and to some economic constraints. I think any inclusive internationalization strategy recognizes the existence of diverse knowledge. We cannot say we are developing an inclusive internationalization strategy and don't include science coming from other culture, for example. Especially, for example, if you are, I can say in Canada, we have a lot of Iranian students. They come from Iran. And they are really numerous. I mean, I think the third group of international students in Canada. And we have very bad relationship with the Iranian government, right? So how we can integrate the students, for example, without taking into consideration the history of the Iranian mathematics, for example. You know, Iran is very well recognized for mathematics. So how can we integrate them? How can we internationalize without taking into consideration their culture, their history? And also we need to internationalize because science, we need to enrich science. We need to introduce and to promote knowledge created by other societies, by other countries. How we internationalize science? There is going to be an exercise here. I'm not sure it will work. So for years now, I have been simplifying what I call systemic internationalization framework. I think, you know, the definition shared with us by Hans de Wit is very, very appropriate when he talks about, you know, the comprehensive internationalization as intention, as a, sorry, it's not the one. Sorry, can I display mine? Okay, so comprehensive internationalization as intentional process, don't follow this is not good. Can you try the second one, the next one? Okay, here. So Hans shared with us this definition of internationalization. So he said it's intentional process of integrating international, intercultural, and the global dimension to the purpose, so the why, to the functions, and the delivery, the way we deliver, the way we provide education or higher education, of post-secondary education. Why? In order to enhance the quality of education and research for all students and the staff, and to make a meaningful contribution to society. So I took this definition, and actually I find in it, for sure, the 3 dimensions or the 3 missions of the university: education, research, and community engagement, the society, contribution to society, the community engagement. So just please retain this 3, okay? Education, research, community engagement. But this is not enough. There is something missing here. Actually, it's your role, my role, your role. All the administration of higher education is not here. If you have Agency of International Relations, I have Vice Presidency of International Relations, I have a role. And the governance of the university. The governance, the board of the university, the president, all the constituency, the ministry, people who govern the university. So I developed the systemic approach for internationalization. And this is what I call, I will use mine, okay? So this is the framework I use for internationalization of higher education. I say it has to be systemic. It means it has to have a system, and to internationalize education, to internationalize research, to internationalize the community engagement. The administration of the university has a role in the internationalization, so what kind of work or actions we have as administration or the management, and the governance of the university. So Andre, what are we displaying? Can you display now? Okay. Okay, so when we take education, actually, and if you tell me you want to internationalize your education, mobility is internationalization of education. It's not internationalization of research, right? It's not internationalization of community engagement. You can have mobility for research. It's different. You can have mobility for international development, for example. But the main objective of student mobility is normally to enhance the education, to give them more opportunities. So for my objective here, I would say, if we take science, if we say we want to internationalize science or any other discipline, okay, as part of education, I can also internationalize science for research or the research of science, okay? So I will just tell you that for any action, for any domain, if we want to internationalize it, we need to think about the purpose. Actually, Hans mentioned also the why. Why we want to internationalize science. What is our vision of internationalizing science? The why. So let me give you some examples. We can say we want to internationalize science, so it goes like this. Internationalization of education, science. My purpose or my main, very, very general objective, the why, is, for example, because of the universality of science. I want to recognize the universality of science, but also because of the importance of local knowledge. I want to integrate local knowledge in my science. But also I want to have diversity of point of view on science, on a theory or in a domain. So this is mainly the purpose, what is driving me, okay? What is driving me to internationalize science? I need to have also what I call specific objectives. I'm sure you know how to develop objectives when we say SMART objective. So we need to develop specific objective. For example, we can say, I want to internationalize science because of the importance of the universality or the local knowledge, and I want to address some SDGs, some sustainable development goals. For example, in my university, we are very strong in education. And we can say that our university is internationalizing education and will contribute to the objective number 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is education of quality. So because we are strong, because we are investing a lot on education, I can say one of my objectives is to deliver or to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. But also, I can say I want to enrich the knowledge of my students by providing them different approach, for example, to mathematics, or different approach to physics, or different approach to history, to geography. So this could be very specific objective, integrate local language, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge. In Canada, we have very measurable and specific objectives in terms of integrating indigenous knowledge, indigenous population in our higher education. So it become one of our objectives. Or also I can say I want to localize. So I want to indeed to work with, for example, French university, because I want to integrate, I want to bring some knowledge, and I want to localize it to my context. So it's not often, teaching in English or in French, but also importing French knowledge and teaching it in Portuguese, for example. Now, I think the most important section is the how to do all that. So, internationalization of education of science, it means I have a curriculum. I have content. So I need to work on my curriculum. I need also to work on the pedagogy, on didactics of science, how we teach science, and how to develop this knowledge of science pedagogy. We can localize, as I said, international curriculum, training on critical thinking. So it's important to, for example, if we are teaching a new discovery, the critical thinking here is very important because we will allow students to know what it means to discover something new and how science is not necessarily the truth. Because, just with pandemics, the COVID-19. Remember when we discovered the COVID-19, the coronavirus, the very few knowledge we had, and 3 years later, how knowledgeable we are about the coronavirus. So there is a lot of actions we can do in order to internationalize the education of science. For example, the history of science discovery, etc. In this system, you will see the same chapters for any action for all dimensions. So for education here, we have vision, objectives, actions, resources, challenges, and evaluation. I like to have very short list of chapters and to repeat them in systemic way so we can compare and we can at the same time be consistent and organized about internationalization. This tool or framework is helpful for the strategy development, is helpful for the institutional development of work plan or strategy or objectives. I also like here to talk about evaluation. When you develop a vision or you develop objective, it's very important to evaluate it. And I propose these three terms in different definitions. There is a theory in international development called outcome mapping. If you Google outcome mapping, you will find the theory. And the explanation of what output is, what outcome is, what an impact is very, again, systemic. For example, the output in this approach is something you can buy, something you pay for, something you can account. For example, the number of articles you published in this area, the number of courses you deliver as a university. This is something you can count. The outcome is the change you introduced or the change you gained after introducing a number of something. And the impact is the long-term effect. Let me give you another example. Oftentimes we say we want to internationalize the university, and they will ask us how many students you will send abroad. And they will calculate our impact by the number of students. This is not the impact, this is the output. The number of students who go abroad is output because you paid for them, okay? You gave them bursary, scholarship, tickets, etc. The outcomes is the change you obtained after their mobility or because of their mobility. For example, they became now French speaker, or they became a global citizen and they are open to the world, or they have good results, they have good marks, they know about mathematics, etc., etc. The impact is, are they really becoming global citizenship, global citizens on the longer term? To what extent their mobility changed them for true in the future? Same for publication. The number of articles you publish is output. The change you obtain because you publish the articles, now you are known abroad, your university is seated, you have PhD students coming from other countries, so this is the change you obtain. And the impact actually should be the impact of your science. For example, do you know if a government, for example, took your article and developed a policy based on your research results? So this is the impact you made. So now, if we want to internationalize, I will move now from education of science to research in science or research in scientific discipline. So how to internationalize research in science or scientific discipline? No surprise, you will find the same system. Again, ask yourself about the purpose, ask yourself about the objectives, the actions, the challenges you may find, and the evaluation, how you will evaluate the internationalization of research. So I'm not developing the vision here. Let me, for example, just develop the actions. If you want to internationalize your research in scientific discipline, you can, for example, take, again, very easy example, the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework. Not only you contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, but you say, in my university, there are 17 objectives, so I will build my international research strategy based on the 17 objectives. Or, for example, if you don't have oceanography, for example, okay, the ocean studies, you can say, I will not touch this objective because I don't have it. So I will not develop it. In my university, again, I said, we have education, so probably the research strategy, international research strategy, will address the goal number 4. We have a lot of work on forestry, so we will address the objectives, work in terms of environment and the climate change. So build international collaboration. Again, when you put it as an action, Okay, international collaboration, it's an action, it's not an objective. Okay, by the way. Partnership is not objective, it's action. So if you put it here, when we ask you, for example, what is your objective, and you say, I want to, for example, learn from French discovery or French Institute of XYZ, so you can say, okay, so then international collaboration is an action to obtain or to achieve this objective, etc. You have a lot of actions. I prefer not to develop all of them. But also, here, you need to ask your vice president about resources, okay? So if the vice president say, my objective is to integrate indigenous knowledge, and you have an action, integrate, for example, localization of knowledge or publication in local languages, so you need to ask your vice president, okay, what are the resources? Do you have the budget? Do you have training on local languages, etc.? And there is some challenges here. It's not easy, and we need to be aware of the challenges. For example, access to resources, language, the place of local languages. Is it accepted to work in local languages in physics, for example? I come from Lebanon, my home country, and I never learned mathematics in Arabic, for example. I don't know mathematics in Arabic. Arabic is my mother tongue. But in Lebanon, mathematics, physics, chemistry, they are taught in French or in English. So there is no place to Arabic language in science in Lebanon. But if you go to Syria or to Algeria, yes, they have Arabic language. So evaluation is the same. So how are you doing in terms of time? So community engagement, again, the same thing. How to internationalize the community engagement in science is awkward, right? Can we think in terms of community engagement in science? Is there a connection here? And especially if we are talking about internationalizing science, I would say yes. For example, knowledge translation. If you are a scientist working on water management, for example, okay, water purification and management, and you want to talk to your city authority, and you go to your city authority with a theory or with some results of science coming from China, only in Chinese language. Probably the mayor or the director of water management in the city here, he or she don't understand Chinese. But also, you have some local issues. You have local circumstances. So all what we call knowledge translation from research to decision making in local languages, in global local and the global perspectives. So all this adaptation of knowledge for decision making in the city or in the country, adaptation of scientific knowledge is key here. And especially if you have a role in policy development, if you are advising authorities or if you are translating this knowledge. So it's just an example, but again, we need to understand what is the role of science in community engagement and what, even on the international level, how we can internationalize the science and community engagement. Also, universities now and scientists are offered opportunities to play an international role, a global role. For example, the Conference of the Parties on the Climate Change, COP. Okay, I think now we are in COP26, I think now. There is a lot of activities, scientific activities around the Conference of the Parties, the COP26 or 27, by scientific, by universities, and we can influence the global decision. I'm here maybe extrapolating from community to the planet because this is exactly my definition of community. Oftentimes when we think about community, we think about the neighborhood. We think about the city where we are. But for us today, because we live in an interconnected society, the community is the planet. From your city to the planet. And I know a lot of researchers who are influencing global policy, global decisions based on their research in their own country. So this is example again of community engagement. And just in case it intrigates you, what is the role of administration and governance in science? As you can see here, I didn't develop the same 6 elements, vision, objectives, etc. But just example of actions the management of a university, the leadership of a university will have to play. For example, the partnership with international science authorities and researchers. The administration, in this case André, Francisco, they need to encourage and to offer the opportunity to partner with scientific or science authorities, international science authorities. They also need to give exposure or visibility to the diversity of views. You cannot, for example, start working with a community if the administration of your university say, no, we don't work with these people. Or they don't recognize your work in your career evolution, right? So the administration of the university has a role in the evaluation and the career development, the accreditation, and also to offer you research facilities, student life facilities in order to internationalize your approach and your scientific work. In terms of governance, again, we are now developing the policy. The governance of the university will need to accept or to recognize different approaches and the points of view in scientific production. For example, in Canada, we are now encouraging or recognizing some different epistemologies of science. The feminist point of view on the society, the LGBTQ point of view on the society. All this diversification may lead to different approaches. So if they are not recognized at the governance level, in the policies of the university, you cannot do it, right? So I don't know if you have here EDI policy, equity, diversity, and inclusion policy. In our university, this is one of the elements of the policy, to recognize the scientific production based on different epistemologies. And also, the intellectual property issue is important here, and it's a governance and administration responsibility. But also, the composition of scientific bodies. For example, how can we talk about indigenous science in Canada if the Research Council of Canada, so the higher authority, don't recognize or don't have scientists from these communities? So in a few words, this is the system I am developing and I'm proposing actually. And the objective of this system is just to help us conceptualize how we develop the vision, the objectives, and how we can, in this case, internationalize science. And a few years ago, actually, I developed exactly the same system, but for languages. So I'm not going to explain now language, but just to tell you that I deployed exactly the same system, but on language. So research and language, education, service à la, sorry, it's in French, I forgot that. So it's community engagement, administration or management, and governance. So my objective is really just to be simple. I think I can say elegant and systemic. Just ask exactly the same question every time we address or we want to internationalize something. So this is the PowerPoint version. In few words, there's a lot of benefits of internationalizing science. We can build the bridges between culture and science, and we can have different connections between different ways of doing research. EDI is one of the concerns now, so there is a way to internationalize science and integrate EDI. In terms of community engagement, localization of research results, knowledge, policies, etc., it's one of them, one of the benefits. And for the administration, the recognition and appreciation of the contribution of inclusive policies are also benefits. There is impacts, sometimes negative impacts of internationalization science. For example, we have sometimes some cultural assumption. What about gender? What about non-binary sexual identity in the research? What about environment and water management? The relationship even to water and to environment, it differs. It's not the same from country to another country. There's a lot of issues in terms of social relationship and education. For example, what is the place of education in economic development? So this also, I mean, in Western countries, we assume that education is a good factor to enhance economic development. It's not the case in all countries. Okay, so it's a cultural assumption. You want an example? Read the news about Afghanistan. Okay, for them, education is not a matter for cultural, for development, for economic development. There is also some local and cultural assumption in terms of health and diseases. So when we do research and we want to internationalize or localize, we need also to be careful about these issues. Political influence. A few years ago, China was one of the best friends of Canada. Today, we are accusing China of spying on Canada, and as a consequence, we are limiting research collaboration with China. And now if you have a research project with Chinese partner, you need to present it to the National Defense or National Security Committee. So it becomes like a big issue. So political influence has a role or influence on the internationalization of science, and for sure, historical and diplomatic relationships have also an impact. So just to say, it's a systemic system or framework for systematic approach. I mean by systematic approach is a methodology, method, consistency. So if we apply it consistently, I think we can elucidate what, for example, Hans told us how to develop, how to integrate all those aspects. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Adele, for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to suggest that we invite our next speaker, Professor Coney, and then afterwards we have time for some debate. So, yes, and coffee after.
Mas não funcionou, cara. não funciona. Daí ele... Nossa, esse...
É porque esse é o LibreOffice, esse não é o...
Aqui, né?
Apresentar e iniciar no primeiro slide.
Ah, então deve ser isso.
Iniciar no slide atual.
Primeiro slide.
Primeiro slide.
Foi.
Daí a setinha só, né?
Vai.
É isso.
Agora volta. Marco, bota essa imagem lá. Se quiser sair, eu já fico aí.
Tinha que arrumar trazer um cabo maior disso aqui.
É o cabo.
So Professor Concepta Margaret McManus Pimentel, ela obteve o grau de Bachelor of Agricultural Science pela University College Dublin, mestrado em Genetics and Animal Breeding pela Universidade de Edinburgh, doutorado pela Universidade de Oxford. Ela recebeu bolsa da CAPES para realizar estudos de pós-doutorado na University of Sydney, é professora titular da Universidade de Brasília, com bolsa de produtividade 1A do CNPq. Tem experiência na área de genética, melhoramento dos animais domésticos, bem como em conservação de recursos genéticos animais e genética de paisagem, utilizando diversas ferramentas de estatística. Publicou mais de 400 artigos em periódicos com corpo editorial, 26 capítulos de livro, 550 resumos em congressos, concluiu mais de 200 orientações de alunos, incluindo 56 mestrados, 30 doutorados, 16 pós-doutorados, 90 projetos de iniciação científica, TCC, além de mais de 20 orientações técnicas. Ela tem atuado junto ao Ministério da Agricultura, bem como junto à FAP do Distrito Federal. Participa de projetos em conjunto com pesquisadores na USDA, na Agricultural Research Council da África do Sul e no INRA da França, dentre outros. Junto à Embrapa, atuou como avaliadora do Comitê Técnico do Macroprograma 2 da Embrapa por mais de 5 anos, além dos programas de aceleração, PAC e Monsanto Embrapa. Tem uma rede de colaboradores de mais de 700 pessoas em publicações nacionais e internacionais, foi diretora de Relações Internacionais da CAPES no período 2016-2019, período em que foi justamente gestado e elaborado e concluído, enfim, o chamado a projetos do PRINT, e é membro da Academia Brasileira de Ciências, Academia Mundial de Ciências para o Mundo em Desenvolvimento e comendadora da Ordem Nacional do Mérito Científico. Em 2022, foi honrada com a cátedra Pascoal Senise na USP. Muito obrigado, Connie.
Muito obrigada. Agradeço muito, agradeço o convite do professor Francisco por estar aqui. Eu vou tentar ser um pouco breve, porque muito que a gente ia falar já foi falada, mas eu vou também mostrar alguns dados, porque, afinal, minha área é melhoramento, estatística, então, que aí eu gosto de dados. Então, vamos trabalhar um pouco com os dados. Próximo slide, por favor. Então, como já foi falado, a gente está olhando mais continuidade, mais produtividade, mais ranking, olhando as challenges. Sorry, I'll talk in English. International challenges such as the SDGs, the complexity of the results that we're looking for, more understanding between peoples, I think, is necessary, and so that our country is actually part of an international community and is not isolated from it. Next, please. So it's the same as building an airplane. So what the science is doing is we're building an airplane, whereby each part of the airplane, for the airplane to be able to fly, which is our science, we have to be able to take information from various parts, various different areas of knowledge, not only technical parts, areas of knowledge, but also the social sciences. For example, how do we get onto an airplane? How do we persuade people that it's safe to fly? So looking towards the internationalization of higher education for society, looking towards the degree of alignment between the policies within the higher education system and the national drivers for policy, so one of those national drivers at print, and then the alignment between the policies and the national drivers for international cooperation. So therefore we have to look at not only what we want to do within the higher education system, but then how that impacts on the global society after that. Next, please. And then, so therefore we have to take into consideration all the stakeholders. And then one of the things that I always like to say is that, I didn't bring my CAP slide with me, but is that everybody looks towards, like, what if I want to change anything, I say, well, what is CAPS going to think about that? But then when we look at who's going to pay for all of that, it's not CAPS that's paying for it, it's actually society that's paying for it. So therefore, we tend to look at the wrong places for the wrong answers. So one of the things that we have to really look at is, and one of the problems I think that we've had in recent years with this, our internationalization and our science, is that we're looking at the wrong places, because we're not looking towards who's paying us to do what we do and to have the freedom to do what we do. And each of the countries and the different stakeholders, the NGOs, the research institutes, each has their own vocation and their demands and their cultures. So we need to see how we can get these all together to be able to solve the problems that we're facing locally, nationally, or internationally. Next, please. And we should think of it as it being collaborative and not competitive. I think that was one of the things that was said earlier on that is very important. And the universities, therefore, are central in constructing this understanding, whereby not only the question of production of the knowledge and innovation itself, but looking towards the highly qualified workforce that we have, the diversity that we have within the universities, whereby we can take the same problem from different points of view, because we have people here in one university, we have people who can understand it from a social science point of view, from a technical point of view, from an implementation or a governance point of view. So therefore, all of these we have within the one place, and therefore that we were ideally placed for this solution of complex problems. And then we also have to know that we don't have to, and we shouldn't be good at everything. Because, for example, MIT is not good at everything. Harvard is not good at everything. Oxford, and I should know because I studied there, is not good at everything. So therefore, why should you think that the Federal University of Paraná is going to be good at everything? It's not. So therefore, we have to have priorities. And then, as somebody said, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. So then one of the questions then we have to do, and especially when money is short, is then how do we going to do this prioritization of our science? But looking towards the question is that if we join together, then we were stronger than if we're apart. Next, please. And then, so we get to the question of internationalization, and one of the questions is, this slide up here, it explains very well, I'm Irish, and the first time I came to Brazil and everybody wanted to give me a kiss on each cheek. And first I was like, what an invasion of space, when everybody wants to come and give you a kiss. And then I started doing the calculations, is that if you have 40 people in a room, well, 41, and then so that's 40 times 40, that's 1,600 multiplied by 2 kisses, 3,200 kisses, like in a 40 by 40 room, so if everybody here started kissing each other, think of all the germs that are going around. So this is really one of the things that we have to be able to understand. Not only internationalization is not just a question of technique, it's also a question of culture. It's also a question of how I interpret what is being said. There's a poem that we learn as a child in school called Humpty Dumpty Sat in a Wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't keep Humpty together again. So it makes perfect sense in English. It makes absolutely no sense in Indonesian, because in Indonesian you do not have a difference between sit and sat. So he couldn't sit on a wall and then fall off it because he had already fallen off it previously. In Russian, if you put it in, then there's the question not only of the time, but there's a question of gender. There's a question of if the action was completed or not. So there are lots of different interpretations for a simple children's poem. Imagine science. Imagine what we're talking about in complexity. So therefore, we need to use internationalization. So internationalization is not a process, it's a utilization of techniques to do this, to get intercultural skills so that we can understand people from different areas, complex problem solving, multidisciplinary teams, access to international resources. The people in the USDA, thanks be to God, they pay for open access for us, so it's great to have that opportunity, that I don't have to worry about that. $3,700 for one paper is, let's talk about it, ridiculous. Infrastructure, skills learning, become more flexible, more tolerant, more curious, more adaptable. All of this has got to do with open science. All of this has got to do with internationalization. Communication, I will talk a bit more about that. Better diploma, jobs and careers, and other ways of doing things. Lots of people say to me, oh, you're Irish, you don't understand that that's the way we do things here. And I said, no, I understand. I also understand we could do things differently. It doesn't have to be that way. We can make things simpler, we can make things more direct. And one of the ideas behind print was that it would be, because as Director for International Affairs, I don't know what the Federal University of Paraná needs. I don't know what USP needs. I don't even know what the Universidade de Brasília needs. So how was I going to do create policies for universities where the universities are much more better placed to be able to apply the policies for themselves? So that was and give back autonomy to the universities in that meaning. Okay, next please. So one of the questions when we look at internationalization, for who's going to benefit? Is personal internationalization or institutional internationalization? Print is an institutional program. It's not a personal benefit program. Who benefits and how are those benefits going to be measured? So this is also different ways of looking at things. Each one has their own ways and both are correct. We cannot say that one is not correct or the other is not correct. Next, please. So when we asked the universities, internationalization, why? This is what they said. The three big replies were, I want to go to Europe or the US, I want to have South-South cooperation, or I want to have specific collaboration with specific countries. Very few people said, I want to improve my science and my technology, I want to work with centers of excellence, or I want to improve fields of expertise. So the question is, who's benefiting from this and why are we doing this? And so I think it's very important that we go back to this discussion and say, why are we what internationalization is for what? And then we go into the questions of how and what impacts, etc. But first of all, why? Next, please. I think here we too have a bit of confusion between the role of Brazilian financing agencies for research and the role of the Agência Brasileira de Cooperação, especially when we talk about SUSU. Because a lot of the programs that we see for South-South cooperation are directed specifically towards, I want to help other countries in the southern region. Okay, but Brazil has because it's still a developing country, and we have an agency that looks after this, or is supposed to look after this. And then we have the university saying, no, but we want to do that too. I said, well, how are we going to do it differently than what's being done by the Agência Brasileira de Cooperação? And so I think that also, when we look at the policies, we have to know what's being done and exactly what you want to do that's going to be different and how that's going to have an impact. Next, please. So what we did was that we took this is a revised network for Southern think tanks on the measurement and evaluation for indicators of measure of quality in South-South cooperation. So there are 20 different indicators looking at 5 different dimensions: inclusive ownership, horizontality, self-reliance, accountability, and development efficiency. And then we look at each one has 5 different indicators. And then what we did was that we took the programs that were in the, next please, in CAP, CMPQ, FAP-ESPI, MEC, MERIE, etc., and we had to look and see how did these align with what the indicators are. And what we can see is that if there was an agreement in place, we got between 7.5 and 10 cooperation agreement. If there was no cooperation agreement, that is Brazil acting by itself, you can see that they, while north-south wasn't too bad, south-south was around about 5.5 of the indicators were met, and multi-agreements were less than 3%, or 3 of the 20 indicators were met. So actually, when we create programs, we have to be very careful about exactly why we're creating these programs. Because if we create programs thinking, oh, I'm going to get in there and going to help, I'm going to do things, but there are rules and regulations that have to be followed to do this well. So one of the things that I would say that with in implementing new policies, that the planning is very, very important when we create these new policies. For if not, we're not going to actually get anywhere with them. Next, please. So what I did was then I looked at Brazilian publishing and internationalization. Okay, and here are the main areas where it looks at: diplomacy, science, publishing as in impact factors, number of papers published, etc. The impact that internationalization has on business and the impact that internationalization has on innovation. So that is basically where Brazil is looking when it's looking towards how internationalization is being used by the community. Okay, next. So here I'm just going to look, when we look at the question of mobility, then what's the language policy that we have when we're going to talk about mobility? And then we come to that. Is it going to be south-south mobility? Is it going to be north-south mobility? How's your English? In the Science Without Borders program, we actually had about 5 billion reais was spent on English abroad for students because they didn't have the sufficient English level to actually go abroad. So that's something that really needs to be worked upon. Accessibility, also very important. Who's going to go? Also in the Science Without Borders, 75% of the students had less than 10 minimum salaries, minimum wages. So it was a program that actually reached a very wide, a broad section of the community. But then, obviously, and so the Science Without Borders is very much linked to the mobility question and the question of internationalization. Next. And then we look at the higher education itself. And then we have this much more complex, so the internationalization of higher education is much more complex than a simple mobility. And I think that's very important because I'll talk about that again in the time. Because we're looking towards the question of soft power and diplomacy, looking towards the psychology, because a lot of students have problems once they go abroad because of the culture problems. Multiculturalism, what the public policy is, what the curriculum is. So all of those have to be taken into consideration within an internationalization policy. Next. And then the internationalization of higher education. Also, we look at then, obviously, COVID had an effect in it, and then going from higher education to science, so that link is then comes in here, and then, obviously, and then the increase of this interaction and the position of Brazil within Latin America as a leader in science in Latin America. So hereby we can study these networks and see how they work before we actually start to construct policies for internationalization. Next, please. So what I did was that I got all the scholarships given by CAP, CMPQ, and FAPESP in the last 15 years. I saw where they went, and then I took publishing patterns, Brazilian publishing patterns with the universities to where these students were sent, okay? And then I classified the students as being undergraduate, postgraduate, or lecturers, and then the time that they spent abroad. Undergraduate students were only were up to basically like sandwich programs. Masters and doctorates could be full time, so I split it by less than 180 days and more than 180 days, and then lectures less than 90 days and more than 90 days, okay? So what we see, we want a probability of impact 2. You see there's a 2 there, okay? So we have to send at least 5 postgrad students. We have to send them to the global north, not global south, if we're going to look towards publications and impact. And we have to send lecturers for at least 90 days. Less than 90 days is not going to start to create these networks. So once again, I go back to the question, I'm going to send mobility. What's the mobility for? Is it to create scientific networks? If it's to create scientific networks, we have rules. If it's not for that, it's for another ends, then the rules are going to be different. Okay? Next. So here, if we look towards scientific cooperation, publishing, undergraduate student mobility does not lead to that. Okay? Obviously, it has great beneficial individual benefits, but not in terms of constructing scientific networks. Postgraduate mobility, only if you have professor mobility involved. Without professor mobility, postgraduate mobility doesn't work that well. No difference between a sandwich and full doctorate, although I did another analysis and I saw that maybe greater than, instead of dividing it at 365 days, if I divided it 180 days, it worked better, so that at least 180 days is better. Less than 180 days is no good. Periods of more than 90 days have to be effective for a professor abroad to be effective. Global South is less effective than Global North. Here we see in terms of publication, in terms of 40 to 60 times more chance of publication if you go to the Global North instead of the Global South. Up here you see the effect of sending a student up there and a lecturer down here. So one is that there's no difference. So less than 1, or more than 1, and here more than 1, sending a lecturer is what, 1.6 or something like that. So impact increases with professor mobility in region, and up to 25% of foreign students abandon postgraduate courses in Brazil. So then we're doing, say, oh, we want to do Global South, but even Global North students here in Brazil, 25% leave the courses. They don't complete the courses. So therefore, there's something wrong with the system whereby we have such a high rate of abandonment here in the country. Next. So this all comes down to the perfect man. The men here doesn't have to listen to this, just the women here. So next, please. So I want my perfect man, okay? My husband died. What am I going to do about it, you know? And here, you know, just take your pick, basically, you know. But when I go to create my policy, my objective, then I have to put that down in writing. And then, so next, please. So here, you know, what I want. He likes to smile, laugh, gives me hugs, listens to me, gives me presents. Well, okay, so who did I describe? Next. So if I don't know what I'm looking for, I'm not going to get it, basically. So one of the things that when we form our internationalization policy is that I have to know exactly what I'm going to look for to build a strategy that makes sure that I get where I want to go and not where I don't want to go. Next, please. So it's going to be like that. Next, please. So as has been said numerous times here, we've been thinking about internationalization a lot based on mobility. Next. But it's much more than that. It's much more than that because we have the curriculum, networking, incorporating new knowledge, publications, impact, social relevance, contracts, attraction of talent. So only 3% of lecturers in Brazil are from abroad, and 70% of them did their doctorate in Brazil, if you look at the data. So it's quite an endogamic process here. It's talking in animal breeding terms, yeah. So next, please. So the question here is that, okay, we do all of this, but how do we appropriate this? What changes? Because if we don't have this appropriation, it's all money spent without any change. And I think that's what Professor Amit said, was that what changes impact. So that's the question, is that how do we get then? And that was one of the things that was important in print, was that what was the change going to be? How was all of this money that was being spent going to change the university, change the thinking, and change how the impact this has, not only on the university, but on the society when the university is inserted. Next. Oh, this is a bit. So this is a physics example. I'm sorry, sometimes it's just, you can, I don't know if you, but three first laws of physics. Energy is conserved, okay? You can't return to the state of energy, the same state of energy, and you can't get out of the system, okay? So it's the same with internationalization. Next. Energy is conserved. If you don't put energy in, nothing's going to change. So it's an active process. Second, you can't reach a state of equilibrium. If it's a closed system and everything, entropy takes charge, okay? And the third is that you can't get out because there's always going to be a new challenge. It's because times change. So therefore, we can take physics, apply physics to social change, okay? Next. So without this plan, okay, it's just like herding cats, okay? And actually, herding dogs is much better, because herding cats is that, but herding the per dog here is like if you see her and she goes and she takes and she puts it in there, but she has no way of keeping it there, so she goes back and she gets another one and she takes it back, okay? And then as soon as she turns her back, off it goes. So if we don't put energy into the system, if we don't create mechanisms whereby the energy that's being put in, we can maintain the advances that we've obtained. And then one of the things that was said earlier was with COVID-19, and that we had a lot of advances, and now all of a sudden we're moving backwards. So how do we keep those advances that we had and move forwards and not backwards? And if we don't have a system in place to do that, well, then we're just herding cats and dogs, basically. Next. So the rationale is to have a plan starting with why. Okay, so why am I getting into this? Who are the people that I want to look towards? And so here we have our undergrad students, we have our postgrad students, we have our lecturers, we have our technical staff. A lot of people complain is that they ring up a university, there's nobody to speak to them in English. So that's a problem if you're talking about internationalization. If I'm taking people from abroad to come here, where am I going to put them up? We don't have student accommodation, we don't have specialized hotels, etc., that receive people on campus. So this is lacking for us. How are we going to advance on that? So this is the types of discussion. So we have to know why, we have to plan. What are the methods that we're going to use? I think this, it's perfect with what you just said. To reach the objective, which is not Papai Noel, that I put earlier on, presumably. I said, I want my perfect man, not Papai Noel. Okay? Next, please. And a lot of it starts with why me? What makes me different? Why would somebody want to collaborate with me, to think that I'm special if I'm not USP or Orgis or wherever? And if I don't know what that question is, or the answer to the question is, how do I expect somebody else is going to know the answer to that question? So I think that's one of the important things, is that I have to look at myself, and I have to know where I'm good, where I'm bad, and I have to admit where I'm bad. You don't have to admit to everybody out there, but you have to admit it in here, okay? And then to see where we can build upon that to attract this international eye. Think of the eye of Sauron, like looking towards you, you know, from the Lord of the Rings, and saying, well, what's going to make him want me or not want me? Next. And obviously, if nobody knows that I exist, it's also, it's a question that nobody's going to want to use you in their internationalization process if they don't even know that you're there. Okay, next. This is a paper that was published in PLOS ONE, where it looks at what people look, how scientists publicize what they do. And so you see here in the bottom, like, congresses and academic journals is very high. We have some work being done by the university in terms of the social communication network, but then look at Twitter, zero, blogs, online news, nobody's using it. And there's a lot of things that are out there that we can use, that we can actually increase the impact of what we're doing, and increase that people know what we're doing, and that can look towards us as being interesting people for them to want to be able to collaborate with. Next. Social networking. So LinkedIn is like it's just in a room somewhere. Twitter is like in a coffee shop. Facebook is a bar on a Friday night. Instagram is a photo album. Pinterest is a notice board. Snapchat is a gossip room. YouTube is a deposit. And Tumblr is a psychologist. So how do I want people to look at me? I can see different platforms and use the different platforms in different ways to increase my visibility. Next. The question of SDGs. This is for Universidade Federal do Paraná. Okay. Brazil is red. UFPR is blue, and the world is white. Black. So you see where you're working is a life on land and zero hunger, which are actually more or less aligned, let's say. You have much less when we look at, for example, no poverty or quality education or good health below the world level. So therefore, we have an idea of where you're working that has a greater impact. Next. So here I took the SDGs and I put the impact by SDG for UFPR. There's a whole pile of other graphs hidden because we have little time. But one of the things you notice is that although we have an increase in international collaboration, we don't have an increase in impact. And a lot of the impact, on average, is below the world mean. So therefore, there's something going on here, so we have to have a look at what's going on to see how we can improve it. Next. So I separated domestic collaboration from international collaboration by SDG. So domestic collaboration, very low impact. International collaboration, much higher impact. So therefore, we have to increase our international collaboration to increase our impact if that's what we want. Okay? And it depends a lot, too, on the area of knowledge. Almost all areas of knowledge are better than one, which is the world mean, when I have international collaboration. Next. One question. Better closed access in high impact than open access in low impact journals? The answer is yes. Why? Because a lot of the low impact journals that we publish in tend to be Brazilian journals, and a lot of it is in Portuguese. Like, for example, the Cielo Network. And a lot of people don't read it because it's Brazilian. Even if it's in English, they won't read it because it's a Brazilian journal. So therefore, it's better that it's closed access in a high impact Q1 journal than, and we published a paper recently, or it hasn't actually been published yet. It will be published pretty soon in the Anais da Academia Brasileira de Ciências exactly on this subject, that says that better closed access and high impact than open access and low impact. Use preprints in sites such as ResearchGate? Yes. Because ResearchGate, every single day I have people asking me for preprints of papers. Every day. From all over the world. How to best use the sandwich doctors to create networks? 4 months is not sufficient. It has to be at least 6 months. Okay? And then the lecturer has to follow up, or the lecturer goes ahead and then brings the students in. But it has to be a collaborative effort. How to define priorities? i.e. that's a problem for the governance. How do I use the quotas that I have? For example, Universidade Federal do Paraná uses 106% of the quotas for PDSE. 106% because there are universities that use 10%. So the 10%, the 90% that are left over are distributed when a pro-rector comes and says, I need more scholarships. And then, obviously, then they get more. So, yes, it is possible, but you have to fight for it. They're not going to get them for free, okay? And the question of appropriation, how you're going to appropriate this knowledge. Okay, next. So here's some more data. International collaboration has been increasing, but it's still below the mean for Brazil. You're blue, Brazil is purple, okay? But you're a lot better than the world. Next. Where do you publish most often? Ciência Rural, Semina Ciências Agrárias, Arquivos de Neuropsiquiatria são Brazilian journals. So maybe if you published in Tropical Animal Health and Production or in Journal of Animal Science or whatever, you would have more visibility than you would in these journals. Next. Are you citing, when you publish, do you cite new material or old material? And here we have, for example, in +1, the mean citation is from 2014, okay? So one of the questions is that when you're writing the papers, then that there should be up-to-date citations and not older citations. Next. Who are you citing? So here who you're citing. And when you cite, who you're being cited by. You see that when you're being cited, people are citing your new work and not your old work. You're citing old work, but who's citing you is citing new work. So therefore, I think that you need a little bit of a change in behavior when looking towards this, who's citing who, and updating your references. Next. Policies. This is what I was telling you about, Francisco. Looking at, you have 724 papers published by the university that are, in the last 10 years, that are used in policy documents. So therefore, not only looking towards citation impact, but political impact as well. Okay? So, of those 124 governments, and go to the next one, please, because it's more interesting here. Of those, normal citation impact is 0.8, and policy documents is 2.6. You triplicated your citation when they're used in policy documents. Next. Who's co-authoring these policy documents? They're Brazilian documents. A lot of them are Brazilian, published abroad. Some of them with the United States, some with Africa, and some with Russia, etc. But it's a fair distribution, but Brazil is here. Next. Who is using that information? A lot of people based in the United States, and one of the slides that's hidden, it'll give you the list of who is actually using this information. So you have the World Health Organization, you have FAO, you have a lot of intergovernmental organizations, you have governments, you have the American government, the UK government, etc., that are using this information. So it'd be interesting to look at that information, look at what they're citing, and see what they're interested in what you're publishing. Because then that will give you also an idea of where you're having an impact. Okay, next. Who are the authors that are being, so here we have an idea of what the research groups that are being cited are. So here you obviously know who they are, because a lot of them I wouldn't know, but here you can identify these groups, and then for what are the areas of knowledge where they work. Next, because we actually looked at who these groups are working with. A lot of Brazil, but here you can see the United States and Portugal and United Kingdom and Argentina. So here you can separate the groups that they're working with and see what these groups are interested in, and therefore increase your visibility to attract these international institutions to work together with you. Next. And what are the areas? So here we have COVID, quality of life, children, taxonomy, the Atlantic forest. So here we have different areas of knowledge whereby you are being cited. Because the size of the circle is actually the citation count, okay? So inflammation, oxidative stress, antioxidants, so we have a lot of biology involved here. Biodiesel, ethanol, etc. So obviously the agriculture and chemical industries. We have taxonomy and Atlantic forest biodiversity, obviously, which is very important. But here then, so we can decide. And this, in the program, it is interactive. So if I put the mouse and see on top of one of them, it'll expand the whole area so I can actually see the different words, and I can make a download of the data as well. But here, so we can have a fair idea of what's going on within the university for when I do construct a policy within the university, I know where to attack. Next. Who's citing you? So who's looking at you? A lot of people, mainly Brazil, but also from the United States. And you see each color is a cluster. So each color probably represents an area of knowledge that's different. And so therefore people will look at you. Different people are using this information in different ways. Next. So just to end, Usain Bolt. So one of the questions obviously is when we talk about science and internationalization is that, you know, what game are we going to play and who am I going to be up against? So obviously I want to be up against somebody that's as good as or better than me, but also that I can play the same game as them. Because if it's Usain Bolt, you see he's here with all these children around him. So how can I use Usain Bolt as a child for me to improve, for me to get better? Next. And one of the questions here is that what game are you going to play? What's your game? You know, which game are you going to be good at? Because there's very little use of getting into a game where you're not going to be good at it. You know, whereby you know going in you're going to lose. Next. So here's an example of 3. The first is a game called Hurley. Nobody ever heard of Hurley, yeah? It's an Irish game. It's one of the fastest and most dangerous games. We used to play it when we were children. Well, actually, the women's game is called camogie, and the men's game is called Hurley. It's the same game, but it's basically, you know, it's not like hockey whereby you can't lift the stick up. That, you know, you lift the stick up and you whack the ball like that, you know. So lots of people have no teeth, or they have, you know, holes in their head or whatever. And the question is Brazil going to play that game? And the reply is no, probably not. Next game is rugby. Okay, rugby Brazil has a national team. Okay, I remember about 5 years ago there was an announcement on the TV whereby there was a Brazilian sitting in the middle of the team and said, yeah, look at, in the last 5 years we have improved from being 10th in South America to being 9th. You know, look at how much we've improved in rugby. The Argentinians improved nothing. They were first and they continue being first. So, and so the question is that also a game that we're going to want to invest in heavily? And then obviously we have soccer, whereby Brazil not only invests heavily, but is also recognized as a world champion in the game. The same with science, the same with priorities, the same, where am I going to play the game? Okay, and that's a question that the university has to ask itself. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Next, please. So we have to look at then the question of the quality of the product. What are the policies and what are the culture then that we're going to use within the university so that we're going to be different? We're going to stand out. We're going to make people remember us. And that so we have these 3 to be different. And and as I said here, people don't remember good, they remember being different. Okay? Next. But you have to be good as well. I'm not saying you don't have to be good. You have to be good. You have to be different. So we have to look at government. We have to look towards government. How are their policies going to affect us? Society, obviously. We can't ignore society. Business, and how we're going to give back to the businesses that are supporting us. The higher education institutes, what's happening abroad, and the legislation. because you know very well, Francisco, you're in that working group. There's a lot of legislation in Brazil that's absolutely useless when we come towards that thing. So there are things that has to be changed, but we also have to change. Next. And the question is that we have to come together. I'll give the example of genetics, because genetics, we work with chemistry, animal production, medicine, statistics, physics, biology, next. And then for that to work, we have to bring it all together. And to bring it all together, next, we need communication. And communication also means we have to understand what the other's saying. Back to my Humpty Dumpty. If we don't understand, then we're not going. Communication doesn't mean talking, it means transmitting a message, and I think that's we need to do with internationalization to get to where we need to go. Next. So, just as a proposal, I propose change. Print was the idea was change, more autonomy for the universities, but looking at for them to be able to improve in accordance with what they needed and not what others needed. Next. So think the strategy and not the activities. What's my strategy going to be in this change? Okay. And then I think the last slide. It's a process, but we're going to get there. Okay, I think the next is just, oh no. And then some areas we're going to go slower, some areas going to go faster, but that's okay, you know, as long as everybody gets there in the end. So thank you very much. I hope it provoked a little thought. I also don't like to give very serious talks because I think, and there's one more slide, because I thought Francisco was going to say something and he didn't. But, do you want to put the last slide? This is Daniel and this is Felipe, okay? And so a lot of people say that I was the mother of print. So, and what I say is that this is Daniel and this is Felipe. Neither of them are called print. I don't know anybody called print, and please don't call me that. Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigado. Thank you very much. Então temos tempo para questões, discussões, provocações. So, let me just start. Professor Adele, you have approached the issue of a very interesting approach about systemic internationalization. And that leads to kind of a more practical question, which is, I would like to know if the situation is the same in the universities you have worked or not. Here in Brazil, when you think in terms of systematic internationalization, there appears a huge problem, which is not only lack of information, but dispersion of information. So there's lots of things going on, and usually the administration doesn't get to know everything that's going on, so it's very difficult to plan what to do and what to do next. So I'm not sure, perhaps from your experience in bigger universities like UBC or Sherbrooke, but this is, for instance, in France, in French universities, this is a huge problem, very close to the situation where here we are in Brazil. There is this not only lack, but dispersion, multiplicity, and what has been called as hidden internationalization. So if you'd have some tips, practical tips on how to start solving and addressing the problem of this kind of dispersion of information. Many times we don't, I go to talk to some researchers and I got to know for the first time that they already have an Erasmus program from 5-6 years, and it just didn't go through the international office, so it was not institutionalized at the level of the university, and that poses a problem because this is a lack of information that I have. So,
thank you for the question. Actually, this is exactly why I introduced in the system the two last dimensions, administration and governance of internationalization. So the first three are internationalization of education, internationalization of research, internationalization of community engagement, and the two last ones are administration of internationalization. So the issue of information is a matter of administration. It's a matter of tools. You know, if you don't believe that information is important for decision making, you don't collect this information. So this is why it's important for us not to have only an agence of international relations, or in my case, Bureau d'Internationalisation, Office of Internationalization, if it's not connected to the whole university. So it's a problem because we in the universities, we are used to work by silos, okay? We are divided, by the internationalization is everywhere. So you need this additional layer to internationalization so you can to be responsible and accountable. So this is the information. Now, you mentioned France, I think. France is not very advanced in terms of internationalization. France is very, very old-fashioned, you know, conservative. Just remember, only 5 years ago, in 2018, they developed their national strategy of internationalization. And they copied a lot of examples from abroad. Until 2018, 2019, they had no recruitment staff in the universities. I remember I went to Montpellier and I asked them what kind of service you offer to international students. They told me we have nothing for international students. If you go to Canada, you have a bureau, you know, Office of International Students. You have, you know, we go to the airport to receive our students. We arrange transportation for them from the airport to the university. I remember a few years ago, I was even helping them, you know, take their suitcase to the residence. So we care about them. So France is developing now. But I think for us it's very important to consider that you cannot internationalize education if you don't have this responsibility in the governance level of the university. You cannot internationalize research if you don't have policies, so at the administration level, for internationalization of research. So I think this system, you know, under bracket I'm proposing, is important for us to understand that administration and governance are very important. And this is exactly what the Association of International Education Administration worked on under the chapter of professionalization of international education. So for example, I don't know in your office, but in my office, I have nobody who is trained in international education. I don't have a PhD in international education. My PhD is in linguistics, right? I don't know your PhD.
Animal breeding.
Animal breeding, and she is in charge of internationalization. So we need to have professionals, experts in internationalization. This, for example, Hans, he works in the Center of International Higher Education. So now they are training specialists in internationalization of higher education. So if you want to innovate here, I don't know if you have a master in international education, but I am pushing a lot in my university to develop a master in internationalization of higher education.
Sophia, sorry, but so quickly, Connie, could you talk about the impacts of the last 6 years in our internationalization, Brazilian internationalization? It means, to me, it's not clear to compare Brazilian internationalization since 2016 to another day, because the government put in place some political that impacted this process. And what is the challenge to the future? Because we are living nowadays the transition. Could you talk about? Thank you.
So, in the last, well, let's take it from 2016, okay? 2016 was the end of Science Without Borders, okay? The last call was in 2014. People forget about this. The last open call was in 2014. 2016 was when the last students went abroad. Okay, 2016 we paid to the American universities. I just have to remember. The total was 15 billion. Hey, I'm just trying to remember exactly because, but that has a lot of questions involved, which is one of the questions was the question of we started off with $1 at 1.4 and ended up with $1 at 4.2. We didn't have enough students that had the language capabilities. So therefore that was a huge problem. And then 1/3 of the resources that went towards that was actually training students abroad because the pressure was to send students abroad. The pressure was not for them to learn anything. The pressure was they have to go abroad. The other question was that less than 50% actually used when they did a discipline or a course abroad that the universities didn't recognize that course. So then one of the questions was when we got print going was that the universities have to send people abroad, and if they send people abroad, they have to recognize what's being done abroad. They can't send people abroad and then wash their hands of it. So therefore, that comes back to the question of appropriation. So when we started talking, I don't know if you remember, but the first time I presented a thought about changing was in 2016 at NPROP in Manaus, I think. So the first time I started saying was, listen, this is not working. And then 2017, we had loads of discussions. In that year, I gave over 100 talks. So as well as other people saying, we have to change, we have to change, we have to change. And I think people recognized that we had to change and that the universities had to make sure that they knew what they were doing and why they were having. And then came the print, and then the print was that we had those that were approved because it was felt that they to do it by themselves. And then there was we had another program whereby those that weren't approved, that they would have actually teaching with that group ACE in the US. We actually contracted them so that they would actually give talks and seminars, etc., to the universities that weren't approved to be able to go on a second round, that they were able to build this internationalization policy. We also had the questionnaire, whereby we asked people why you want to do internationalization, and I think there was a big shock to people, because all of a sudden they realized that they didn't know why. But I think it's necessary to do that again, so that people can become more aware why. Because internationalization is important. Obviously, then I was exonerated. So then after print was started, then obviously all that we had planned to do sort of was left up to the universities to do by themselves, without much, because I don't think that the universities are quite ready yet to be able to go through the process by themselves. You need people to say, am I doing it right? What do I need to do? How do I need, what are you thinking here? How do we get it? So I think that lacked. So I think maybe the universities didn't go as far as they could have gone with the process. I think it started them thinking about it. One of the other questions was that I think the international offices in the universities had basically washed their hands of the lecturers that were in the postgraduate studies. I think there was a total disconnect between the two, because it was that, everybody does science is automatically international, so therefore you don't have to worry about it, whereby actually they should worry about it, because it filters on down to undergraduate teaching, it filters on to how the university is perceived, it filters into what are the priorities for financing, it filters into a whole series of other things. And I think that it improved, but I don't think it went as far as it could have gone had it been correctly, with orientation and alignment and all of those discussions that were necessary for it to go further and to deepen the process. So I think it improved, but it could have gone further. And then came a change in government, and then came COVID, and I think we're starting to see also, because science, it takes time to have an impact. So a lot of people, I don't know if you know that it takes, I like data. A Brazilian citation costs 1/12 of a citation from Qatar in terms of money invested. 1/12. It's a half of what Portuguese, one citation from Brazil is costs 1/2 of what a Portuguese citation costs in terms of money invested. So Brazilians can do it with less money. That's a fact. But so we continued increasing throughout 21. In 22, we're starting to see quite rapid fall in the number of publications and in the impact of those publications. And a lot of that is coming because our machines are getting older. We spent 2 years without having money for resources, financial resources for buying material for laboratories, buying all of that sort of stuff. So that, it takes time, because people also have learned that, okay, well, we keep a little bit of money aside for the poorer days, and so we use that money up, that money's gone. So what are we going to do about it now? So I think that the new regimes are going to have to think very carefully about what the priorities are. And like I said, when I hear a lot of this discussion with the Sul-Sul, so we want the South-South collaboration, and I think it's very important that we have the South-South collaboration. If we look at today, Argentina and Chile and Colombia, they're areas of knowledge that are well ahead of us. When I was in CAPS, Chile didn't want to negotiate anything with us. They wanted only North collaboration. South Africa, there's several areas of knowledge in South Africa that are well ahead of us. So I think when we talk about South-South collaboration, I think we have to know exactly what we're talking about. And then we're going to help the other universities. I would say, okay, so we're going to help them, but how are we going to help them if a lot of our universities are behind what they are? And then if you look at the data, when we have South-South collaboration in science, when it's successful, it's triangulated. It's Brazil with a southern country and with a northern country. So it's not Brazil and a southern country. It's Brazil and at least 2 other players in the game. So I think then, so we're going to have these, programs and etc. So what are they for? And then when I look at the data from PEC-G and PEC-PG, 25% of this, people going back. We have a whole pile of them who stay in the country. They don't go back to their own countries. So we're not actually forming people to go back to their own countries and to improve the university there. So I'm working with people from the University of Arizona at the minute, whereby the university we're working with University of Arizona, Brazil, some University of Lucinda in the northeast, and then people in Africa, but a lot of other problems is that where you try to take a technology that works in Brazil and try to implant it in another country, it doesn't work because you have cultural differences, you have different ways of doing things, so you can take the knowledge, but it has to be applied in a different manner. You have to localize the knowledge. So I think that's very, very important when you think about constructing these programs, is that how you construct them so that they will actually be effective in the country that you want them to be effective in. And so, there are a lot of studies on this, and Brazil has been very fortunate in some places and unfortunate in others when it has tried to do this, and some people call it recolonization, because Brazil comes and tries to recolonize the country that has been colonized previously by the French or by the Germans or by the Belgians or whatever. So we have to be very, very careful when we construct this. And I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. But so I would say, why you want to do it? What are your strategy for doing it, and what are the impacts that you want to have? Whether it's, I think, is basically what was said here. I'm really sorry, I talk too much.
Well, thank you so much for both talks. They were really, really nice, very full of experience. But I'm really curious. I think both of you approach the outcomes, the outputs, and the impacts. Okay. In different ways, you did, but both of you approach that. And I guess we all talk about outputs. What about outcomes? How do we manage those outcomes? I'm not even going to the impacts, which I think they are even further away, because outcomes is what we want. Without a really good, important outcome, culture will not change, and we'll be keeping on feeding ourselves and say we won't move forward. So I would like to have some more information on this. I think this is really important.
Thank you for the question. And I have 2 or 3 presentations about evaluation of outputs, outcomes, and impacts. You talked about impacts also, but you are not talking about the same thing. Okay, it's completely different things. And this is one of my personal problems with Elsevier and Web of Sciences and these tools, because they talk about the impacts, and actually what we are measuring here, sorry Connie, we are measuring the impacts of the publishing and not the impact of the content. You know, the citation, you can see a skyrocketing citation, but probably, I mean, some of them, you will see a good percentage of critics to your article. They are saying you are bad, you are very bad scientist, your data is scrap, but you skyrocket in the citation. And this is the problem with this kind of measuring impacts in Web of Science by Elsevier and all those tools. And this is why, personally, I took a theory of change. There is a theory of change measuring the international development. You know, when, for example, a development agency, they go to Africa and they help country, they measure their impact. For example, that's why I put the first slide was about the cooperation, Agency of Cooperation. Yeah. So I really urge you to look for a theory called outcomes mapping. Okay, it's a theory, you have books on it. And this theory actually is used in international development communities by NGOs, another group. And they say, when I work with a country, I put money, this is inputs, I see something happening immediately. Let's call it outputs, okay, something now. For example, if I put water here, I can see the water. So this is the outputs, very concrete. In terms of publishing, this is the number of articles you publish. For example, your vice president could say, now every time you publish an article, I will give you a scholarship. So you start writing, okay? And you will win 10 scholarships, and you will be the most quoted or the most published faculty member in the university. Okay, so what? What change did you made in the world? Your career, yes. You have more money, you have more support, you are famous. So what? Outcomes is the change your article will make in the world, okay? The outcome is, for example, your article is now not only quoted, but it is used in the classroom. So the knowledge is transferred, okay? And the impact, you are right, impact is very difficult to measure. And if somebody will tell you you have X percentage of impact, he or she is lying, okay? Because impact is difficult to measure. But impact can be seen. You can see the impact. Okay, I will tell you a story. It happened yesterday to me, here, okay? In 2015 or 16, I received at the university 2 students from Brazil. One of them, Amanda, she called me yesterday. She wrote on the website, on my LinkedIn page, because she saw my post. Okay, we are still connected since 2016. I never heard about her for 4, 5, 6 years now. Yesterday, I published a post. I said, happy to be at Curitiba attending the seminar. She saw the seminar, the post, and she wrote to me. She said, happy to see you are still collaborating with Brazil. I went from Canada to France. I worked in France in a marketing agency, and now I am back to Canada as professional in forget what. So, the output of Science Without Border at my university, it was 2 students only. Only 2 students. The outcome, I don't know how to measure it, but the impact 10 years later, or 8 years later, is Amanda. She is now professional. She has very good connection to Canada, and she remember me. So I can tell the story. So you can publish an article about your work in the street. You can have an outcome. You can change the life of somebody, and you can teach in the school what you did. And the impact on the longer term, where this person becomes, for example, professional because you changed her life or his life, and he is now has a family, etc. You saved somebody. So this is, you need a theory of change in internationalization. And the theory of change is why you do what you are doing. So this is, I'm using outputs, outcomes, and impacts in very specific definition. I have to explain the definition every time. And actually in this theory, if you look at it, outcome mapping, there is song. And the song says, don't look for impact. Don't look for impact. Okay, don't look for impact. It's long term.
No, just to say too that I agree that one type of measure of impact is what Elsevier and they do. But then I also presented the NEST indicators, which is another type of impact. And then I also presented the data that was about the policy's impact. So there's 50,000. But what I'm trying to say is that, what do you want?
Actually, you need to say impact of what?
Yeah.
It's exactly like internationalization. Okay, we say internationalization. Internationalization of what? Because, you know, if you are in the commerce and the trade, international trade discipline, internationalization means something completely different. Yeah. Internationalization is internationalization of commerce, internationalization of productions, internationalization of finance. So here we are talking about internationalization of higher education. What higher education means? So we need now to, again, decline that research, education, okay? I like these fives.
Bem, se não há nenhuma outra questão, acho que podemos encerrar a nossa primeira tarde de conversa, discussão. So, thank you so much, Adele. Thank you so much, Connie. It was really enlightening, provoking, and we all get material to think through right now. Thank you. So, muito obrigado. E amanhã seguimos na parte da tarde, a partir das 14 horas, mas nas Ciências Sociais Aplicadas, no auditório, nós teremos então as apresentações das agências vinculadas aos consulados da França, da Alemanha.